I slowly set the salad plate down on the pristine mahogany table. My mother-in-law sneered, her voice carrying across the entire dining room, stating that the help does not sit with family. I looked her straight in the eye, smoothed my apron, and replied with absolute calm. You are right, the help does not sit here. But you are mistaken about one thing. This is my resort. My name is Hannah. I am 34 years old, and for years I lived a double life. To my husband and his incredibly arrogant family, I was just a quiet, unassuming woman from a working-class background who got lucky by marrying into their supposedly prestigious lineage. In reality, I am a boutique hospitality investor. I run a private family office, limited liability company that specializes in buying distressed luxury properties and turning them into highly profitable resorts. I kept my wealth entirely hidden behind airtight non-disclosure agreements and corporate veils. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people who underestimated your worth and treated you like a servant. The facade of my marriage began to crack under the crushing weight of my husband Connor and his massive ego. Connor is 36 years old and presents himself to the world as a visionary chief executive officer of a logistics tech startup. He wears tailored Italian suits, drives a leased luxury sports car, and throws around business buzzwords to impress anyone who will listen. The truth is, his startup is a hollow shell burning through venture capital with zero actual profits. He is drowning in debt, but his mother Patricia refuses to see him as anything less than a golden god. Patricia is 62 years old, and the absolute definition of newly acquired wealth without the class to match. She constantly looks down her nose at everyone she deems beneath her, which includes me. She never missed an opportunity to remind me of my humble beginnings, acting as if Connor had rescued me from a life of poverty. This dynamic reached its breaking point during our trip to the Coral Keys Resort in Florida. The Florida sun was beating down mercilessly, raising the temperature to a sweltering 95 degrees, with suffocating humidity. The grand entrance of the resort was a masterpiece of tropical luxury, featuring towering palm trees, cascading waterfalls, and white marble walkways that gleamed under the bright sky. We had just pulled up to the main valet station. I was already exhausted from the long flight, but the nightmare was just beginning. Before the valet could even open my door, Patricia shoved her heavy mink coat directly into my face. Who brings a mink coat to Florida in the middle of a heat wave, I thought to myself. It was purely for show, a heavy, suffocating symbol of her vanity. The thick fur hit my cheek, followed immediately by her authentic designer handbag hitting my chest. She stepped out of the luxury sport utility vehicle, adjusting her oversized sunglasses, and loudly ordered me to get the 6 massive suitcases out of the trunk. She told me to make sure the bellhops did not scratch the leather because they were limited edition pieces. I stood there holding her heavy winter coat in the blistering tropical heat, feeling the sweat bead on my forehead. Patricia did not lower her voice as she addressed me in front of the entire valet staff and several wealthy guests walking by. She proudly announced that only her wonderful son Connor possessed the class, the wealth, and the sophisticated connections to book out the entire VIP wing of this exclusive resort for her 60th birthday celebration. She looked me up and down with utter disgust. Then she told me that I needed to learn how to behave like a proper grateful wife instead of an awkward charity case who did not know how to exist in high society. I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply swallowed the humiliation, gathering the heavy bags one by one. I played the part of the obedient, submissive wife perfectly. I hauled the heavy luggage onto the brass carts, ignoring the sympathetic looks from the resort staff. I knew something they did not. I knew that I had secretly purchased 85% of this exact resort 3 years ago through my hidden trust fund. Every marble tile Patricia stepped on, every palm tree she admired belonged to me. Meanwhile, Connor stood a few feet away, entirely ignoring my struggle. He was busy stroking his own ego loudly, taking credit for the lavish vacation. He bragged to the valet manager about his tech company, acting like a true Silicon Valley titan taking a well-deserved break. He soaked in his mother's relentless praise, completely comfortable with letting his wife perform manual labor in the scorching heat. Harrison. My 65-year-old father-in-law walked in right behind Patricia. He was a man who enabled his wife and son at every turn, always looking at me with a subtle, condescending smirk. He patted Connor on the back, completely ignoring the fact that I was struggling with the luggage carts. Right behind Harrison was Rachel, Connor's 32-year-old sister. She was a spoiled princess who ran a failing local boutique clothing store, funding her shopping addiction through loans she could never repay. Rachel was busy snapping pictures of the lobby for her social media, complaining loudly that the flight had ruined her hair. Walking silently beside Rachel was her husband, Terrence. Terrence is a 35-year-old African-American corporate auditor with a sharp analytical mind. He always looked incredibly out of place among my husband's pretentious family. Terrence was the only one who noticed me struggling. He immediately stepped forward, offering a quiet apology as he grabbed two of the heaviest suitcases from my hands. I gave him a small nod of gratitude. We shared a silent understanding, both of us being outsiders trapped in this toxic family web. Rachel quickly scolded Terrence, telling him to stop acting like a bellhop and hurry up further, highlighting the deep disrespect that flowed through their family veins. I followed them inside the grand lobby. The air conditioning provided a brief relief, but the tension was thick. Connor marched up to the exclusive VIP reception desk, leaning against the polished stone counter with absolute arrogance. He flashed $1 million smile at the concierge and smoothly handed over his heavy platinum credit card to cover the incidental deposits and room upgrades he had promised his mother. I stood a few paces back, my hands burning from gripping the heavy luggage straps. I watched the concierge run the card through the terminal. The machine emitted a sharp, unpleasant beep. The concierge maintained a professional, neutral expression, but his voice carried perfectly across the quiet marble lobby. He informed Connor that the card had been declined. Connor scoffed loudly, waving his hand as if it was a ridiculous technical error. He pulled out a second premium credit card, making a joke about fraud alerts, and handed it over. The concierge ran it again. Another sharp beep echoed in the lobby. Declined again. The color rapidly drained from Connor's face. His confident, arrogant posture crumbled in an instant. The illusion of the wealthy tech billionaire was cracking under the reality of his massive hidden debts. He stood frozen at the reception desk, the silence stretching out painfully as the concierge politely waited for another form of payment. Panic set in. Connor slowly turned his head and looked over his shoulder directly at me. His eyes were wide with pure terror, silently begging me to step forward to use my own funds to fix his humiliating mess in front of his mother and the resort staff. The silence at the reception desk was deafening. Connor stood frozen, his arrogant smile completely wiped away by the sound of his declined credit cards. Patricia tapped her manicured fingers impatiently against her designer handbag, completely oblivious to her son's financial ruin. She loudly complained about the resort staff being incompetent, demanding that they hurry up because her feet were hurting. Connor shot me a look of pure, desperate panic. He was silently begging me to save him from being exposed as a fraud in front of his wealthy mother and the high society guests lingering in the lobby. I maintained a perfectly blank expression. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I turned slightly away from the group, pretending to check a text message. In reality, I opened a highly encrypted application tied to my private limited liability company. I navigated to the hidden back-end financial portal of the Coral Keys Resort. With a few swift practice taps, I authorized a direct, untraceable manual deposit of $25,000 to the front desk ledger. Within seconds, the concierge's computer screen flashed a bright green approval. The concierge, a consummate professional who knew exactly how to handle wealthy egos, smoothly smiled at Connor. He apologized profusely, stating that the international banking system had experienced a momentary security glitch, and the transaction had now miraculously gone through. The color instantly rushed back into Connor's face. He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, puffing out his chest. He loudly berated the concierge for the inconvenience, claiming that his bank is always overly protective of his massive tech fortune. He turned back to his mother, acting like the conquering hero who had just resolved a minor peasant issue. Patricia beamed at him, completely buying the illusion. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Connor did not even look at me to say thank you. He simply assumed I had quietly paid the bill like the obedient, financially useful stepping stone he believed me to be. A private bellhop escorted us to the top floor of the resort. The doors of the private elevator opened directly into the presidential oceanfront villa. The sheer opulence of the space was staggering. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a panoramic view of the turquoise Atlantic Ocean. The floors were imported Italian marble, and a massive crystal chandelier hung over a custom dining table. Patricia walked in, like royalty, dropping her belongings on the nearest silk armchair and demanding a glass of champagne. The villa was massive, but it was designed with exactly 3 master bedroom suites. Patricia immediately took charge of the room assignments, pacing the living room like a general ordering her troops. She pointed to the largest suite at the end of the hall, featuring a private wraparound balcony and a soaking tub. She declared that she and Harrison would take the grand suite because it was her birthday weekend, and she deserved the best view. Harrison simply nodded, sinking into a leather recliner without a word of protest. Next, Patricia pointed to the second master suite on the left. She told Rachel and Terrence to take that room because Rachel needed plenty of closet space for her outfits. Rachel squealed with delight, grabbing Terrence by the arm and dragging him toward the door, demanding he carry all 8 of her shopping bags inside immediately. Finally, Patricia turned toward the third and final master suite. She smiled warmly at Connor and told him he would take that room. She emphasized how hard he worked running his massive tech startup and how much he needed a quiet, luxurious space to rest his brilliant mind. I stood there next to the luggage carts, waiting for the obvious math to resolve itself. 3 bedrooms for 3 couples. But Patricia did not look at the third bedroom. She looked directly at the velvet sectional sofa in the center of the living room. She turned to me with a sickeningly sweet smile that masked her pure malice. She told me that I would be sleeping on the living room sofa. She stated in a voice loud enough for the entire family to hear that Connor has incredibly important virtual meetings with overseas investors this weekend. She claimed that I have a habit of snoring and tossing around in my sleep. She said that a man of Connor's stature cannot afford to be sleep-deprived because of a restless, clumsy wife. She casually pointed to a small wooden cabinet in the hallway, mentioning there might be a spare wool blanket inside for me to use. Connor did not say a word. He just smirked, grabbing his leather overnight bag and walking into his private suite, leaving his wife to sleep in a public walkway. The blatant humiliation hung heavy in the air. I looked down at the floor, acting properly chastised, but then a deep voice cut through the tension. Terrence stepped out of the second bedroom hallway. His jaw was clenched tight. He looked from the velvet sofa to Patricia, and then to Connor's closed door. He spoke up, his tone professional but sharp. He asked Patricia if she was seriously suggesting that a grown woman sleep on a couch in a shared living room while her husband sleeps in a king-sized bed. He pointed out the sheer absurdity and disrespect of the arrangement, stating that Connor could easily share the room with his own wife. Rachel immediately rushed out of her room, slapping Terrence on the chest. She loudly told him to mind his own business and stop trying to ruin her mother's birthday mood. Patricia turned her piercing gaze toward Terrence. She looked him up and down with a deeply offensive, calculating stare. She used a tone dripping with racial and class microaggressions. She told Terrence that he simply did not understand how their legacy family operates. She suggested that a man from his particular background should focus less on questioning family traditions and focus more on using his strong build to finish carrying the rest of Rachel's heavy bags. The insult was heavily veiled, but the venom was crystal clear. It was a sharp reminder that to this family, Terrence was just as disposable and beneath them as I was. Terrence's hands curled into tight fists at his sides. I could see the anger burning in his eyes. He looked across the room and his eyes met mine. In that brief moment, a silent current of absolute understanding passed between us. We were the outsiders. We were the people this family thought they could step on, use, and discard without consequence. I gave Terence a very small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent plea telling him to let it go for now. He held my gaze for a second longer before turning around and walking back into his room, slamming the door behind him. I obediently walked over to the hallway cabinet. I pulled out a thin, scratchy blanket and draped it over the velvet sofa. Patricia smiled in triumph, pouring herself another glass of champagne, before retiring to her oceanfront suite with Harrison. The villa finally went completely silent. I lay on the sofa in the dark, listening to the rhythmic sound of the ocean crashing against the shore outside the glass windows. I waited patiently, watching the digital clock on the wall glow in the darkness. 11 o'clock passed. Then midnight. When I was absolutely certain the entire family was in a deep sleep, I slowly sat up. I folded the cheap blanket perfectly and set it aside. I smoothed out my clothes, shedding the posture of the defeated, obedient wife. I walked silently down the hallway and bypassed the main doors, heading straight for the private service elevator. I pressed the button for the basement level. The elevator descended smoothly, taking me far away from the penthouse. When the doors opened, I stepped into a dimly lit, highly secure concrete corridor. This was an area strictly off limits to resort guests. I walked past the security cameras, which I had personally authorized the installation of years ago. I reached the end of the hallway where a heavy, solid oak door stood. The brass plaque on the door read, "General Manager Private." I reached into the hidden lining of my jacket and pulled out a solid black, unmarked magnetic keycard. I held it against the electronic scanner. The machine emitted a soft click, and the light flashed a bright, welcoming green. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside the true seat of power in this resort. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the quiet hum of the resort basement. The office was a masterclass in understated power, featuring dark walnut paneling, minimalist leather furniture, and walls lined with architectural blueprints of the property. Standing rigidly beside the massive executive desk was Mr. Caldwell, the seasoned general manager of the Coral Keys Resort. He had been expecting my arrival since the moment my secure keycard bypassed the lobby elevators. As soon as I stepped onto the plush carpet, he immediately bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. "Welcome back, Madam Chairman," he said, his voice steady and strictly professional. I offered a polite nod and walked around the desk, taking my seat in the high-backed leather executive chair. The contrast between my current reality and the velvet sofa I had just been banished to upstairs was almost poetic. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence of the room center my mind. 3 years ago, this very resort was drowning in Chapter 11 bankruptcy, crippled by poor management and toxic debts. While Connor was busy burning through venture capital and pretending to be a tech visionary in the public eye, I had quietly utilized my private family office trust to acquire 85% of the property for pennies on the dollar. I kept the acquisition entirely anonymous, shielded by layers of limited liability companies and strict non-disclosure agreements drafted by top-tier corporate attorneys. Connor always believed my investments were small, negligible side projects meant to pass the time. He had absolutely no idea he was currently vacationing in my house, sleeping under my roof, and disrespecting the majority shareholder of the very ground he walked on. I instructed Mr. Caldwell to hand over the latest financial dossiers. He slid a sleek silver tablet across the desk, already unlocked and synced directly to the secure internal accounting mainframe. I needed to see exactly what Connor was doing with his supposedly unlimited birthday budget. My eyes scanned the digital ledgers, tracking the rapid sequence of charges applied to the penthouse suite over the last few hours. The sheer volume of his spending was pathetic, but entirely predictable. He had already wasted thousands of dollars on vintage champagne, imported caviar, and extravagant spa packages for Patricia and Rachel. He was using my shared marital credit line to fund his desperate illusion of wealth. However, as I scrolled deeper into the event planning subfolders, my trained eyes caught a glaring anomaly. There were 4 highly suspicious transactions logged under a vendor code I did not recognize. Each charge was for exactly $9,500 deliberately kept just under the $10,000 threshold that would automatically trigger federal banking alerts. They were billed as custom floral arrangements and premium audiovisual equipment rentals for a non-existent private gala. I tapped the screen to expand the digital receipts. The authorizing signature on the requests belonged to Connor. The employee processing these massive fraudulent charges was listed as an event coordinator. I cross-referenced the employee identification number with the Human Resources database. The screen populated with a profile picture of a 28-year-old woman named Vanessa. She was the same event coordinator I had noticed hovering around the main lobby earlier that afternoon, offering Connor overly eager smiles while ignoring the rest of the family. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, feeling a cold, calculating clarity wash over me. Connor was not just spending my money to look rich. He was actively conspiring with a resort employee to generate fake invoices. They were effectively laundering money straight from my marital credit accounts into his own pocket, or worse, into a hidden offshore account they shared. This was textbook wire fraud and corporate embezzlement happening right under my nose. I needed visual confirmation to seal the trap. I opened the live security surveillance application on the tablet. The Coral Keys Resort is equipped with state-of-the-art high-definition cameras covering every inch of the property, carefully positioned to protect high-net-worth guests. I brought up the security grid and began filtering the live feeds. I skipped the bustling main lobby, the grand dining room, and the casino floor. I focused my search on the secluded late-night areas restricted from general access. I clicked on the feed for the South Cabana Pool, a luxurious section of the resort strictly closed for maintenance until the following morning. The high-definition night vision camera sprang to life on my screen. The pool area was dark, illuminated only by underwater LED lights, and completely deserted except for 2 figures standing near the edge of the water. I zoomed in on the figures. It was Connor. He was not in his luxury suite conducting vital overseas business meetings, as Patricia had loudly and proudly claimed to the entire family. He was pressing Vanessa against a decorative stone pillar, his hands roaming freely over her resort uniform. They were kissing passionately, completely reckless, and consumed by their own arrogance. The security system in this specific high-roller area included ambient audio recording for liability purposes. I tapped the volume icon and turned it up just enough to hear the crystal-clear audio feed flooding into the quiet office. Connor pulled away from Vanessa for a brief second, laughing softly as he stroked her hair. He told her she was an absolute genius for figuring out how to bypass the accounting software to process the fake invoices without alerting the finance department. Vanessa giggled, tracing her manicured fingers down his chest. She looked up at him with greedy eyes and asked him how much longer she had to wait before he finally got rid of his boring, useless wife. Connor kissed her neck and confidently promised that their waiting game was almost over. He swore to Vanessa that the second he drained the last drop of equity from the Seattle house, he was going to cut loose his country bumpkin wife and leave her with absolutely nothing. He promised they would take the laundered cash file for immediate divorce and move into a luxury loft in Miami where they belonged. I stared at the glowing screen. A normal woman might have cried, screamed, or thrown the expensive tablet across the room in a fit of betrayed rage. But I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. I felt an icy, terrifying calm settle deep into my bones. Connor had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him legally, financially, and socially. I locked the tablet screen and handed it back to Mr. Caldwell. I instructed him to quietly compile every single piece of documentary evidence regarding the fake invoices and burn a pristine copy of the security footage to an encrypted external drive. The game had officially begun. The morning sun breached the massive glass windows of the resort lobby, casting long golden shadows across the imported Italian marble floor. After spending the night on the uncomfortable velvet sofa, I rose early, my mind buzzing with the digital evidence I had secured in the underground office. My posture was straight, my resolve absolute. I walked into the grand dining pavilion, blending in perfectly with the early morning high net worth guests, though I was entirely focused on the performance I had to maintain for just a little while longer. My phone buzzed with a demanding text message from Patricia. She required 4 custom-ordered artisanal coffees from the exclusive Reserve Cafe located near the east wing of the resort. She specifically mandated that I carry them up to the penthouse myself because she did not want the standard room service staff interrupting her morning beauty routine. It was a petty, demeaning task designed to remind me of my place at the very bottom of the family hierarchy. I calmly locked my phone, walked to the Reserve Cafe, and placed the order. I stood near a massive decorative stone pillar, holding a silver tray, laden with 4 scalding hot, intricately prepared beverages. That was when I saw her. Vanessa strutted across the polished floor, wearing her tailored resort uniform like it was a runway gown. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she moved with an exaggerated sway, radiating the unearned arrogance of a woman who mistakenly believed she had secured a billionaire tech executive. I recognized the subtle gleam of a new diamond tennis bracelet resting against her collarbone, a piece of jewelry undoubtedly purchased with the stolen funds from my marital credit line. Vanessa locked her gaze onto me from across the room. Her eyes narrowed with a predatory gleam. She did not alter her path to walk around me. Instead, she accelerated her pace, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble. I stood perfectly still, reading her body language, calculating her exact trajectory. She wanted a confrontation. She wanted to assert her dominance in the harsh light of day, emboldened by the illicit promises Connor had whispered to her in the dark. With a sharp, deliberate twist of her shoulder, Vanessa forcefully slammed her body directly into mine. The impact was violent and entirely intentional. The silver tray tipped violently. 2 of the large, scalding hot coffees tipped over the edge, spilling their boiling dark contents directly down the front of my light-colored silk blouse. The intense heat seared through the delicate fabric, burning the skin on my chest and stomach. I gasped sharply, taking a step back as the dark liquid completely ruined my clothing and pooled at my feet. The shattering sound of the ceramic cups hitting the marble floor echoed loudly through the serene cafe, instantly drawing the attention of several wealthy guests and resort staff. "Oh my goodness, I am so incredibly sorry." Vanessa gasped loudly, her voice dripping with thick, theatrical shock. She raised her hands to her mouth in a perfectly choreographed display of innocence. But as she looked down at my ruined blouse, a cruel, victorious smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She leaned in just a fraction of an inch, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for me. "You really should watch where you are walking, you clumsy housewife." Before I could even process the physical sting of the burns, a shrill, piercing voice cut through the murmurs of the observing crowd. "What on earth is going on here?" Patricia marched into the cafe, her face flushed with extreme irritation. She had apparently grown tired of waiting in the penthouse and decided to come down to the lobby. She took one look at the shattered ceramic, the spilled coffee, and my stained clothing. She did not ask if I was burned. She did not ask if I needed a towel or medical attention. Instead, her eyes darted to Vanessa, noting the employee name tag and the official resort uniform. Patricia immediately rushed forward, placing a comforting hand on Vanessa's shoulder, completely ignoring me. "Oh, you poor dear," Patricia cooed to the mistress who was actively sleeping with her son. "I hope none of that hot coffee splashed onto your uniform. Please forgive my daughter-in-law. She is incredibly clumsy and has absolutely no spatial awareness." Vanessa immediately shifted her posture, playing the role of the gracious, wronged employee. She offered Patricia a sweet, forgiving smile, claiming that it was perfectly fine and that she was just worried about the mess on the beautiful floor. Patricia turned her furious glare toward me. Her voice was loud, weaponizing her classist hatred for everyone in the cafe to hear. "I cannot take you anywhere without you causing an absolute disaster. Look at this mess. You are embarrassing our entire family in a 5-star establishment. But I suppose I cannot blame you. You come from such a poor, unrefined background. You simply are not used to walking in luxurious places without tripping over your own feet. You lack the basic grace required to exist in high society." The sheer toxicity of her words hung heavily in the air. Guests at nearby tables averted their eyes, visibly uncomfortable with the blatant emotional abuse happening in public. Vanessa stood right next to my mother-in-law, her shoulders shaking slightly as she tried to suppress a triumphant laugh. She looked at me like I was an insect waiting to be crushed, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my total humiliation. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had successfully asserted her dominance, secured Connor's wealth, and publicly shamed the obstacle standing in her way. I looked down at the dark, ruined silk clinging to my burned skin. A normal person would have fled the room in tears, broken by the public degradation and the agonizing sting of the hot liquid. But my heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. The digital files securely locked in my underground office flashed vividly in my mind. The fraudulent invoices, the security footage of their late-night confession, the undeniable proof of their corporate embezzlement. I did not reach for a napkin. I did not attempt to wipe the dark stain from my chest. I slowly raised my head, maintaining a posture of absolute, unshakable authority. I looked right past Patricia's furious face and locked my eyes entirely on Vanessa. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. The kind of smile that makes predators realize they have just walked into a steel trap. I kept my voice incredibly calm, smooth, and chillingly polite. "It is perfectly fine," I said, maintaining unblinking eye contact with the smirking event coordinator. "This shirt is just fabric. It can easily be washed clean. But your dignity cannot be Vanessa." I turned my back on them and walked away. Patricia was still squawking behind me, her shrill voice echoing off the grand marble walls of the lobby. She demanded that I return immediately and apologized to the event coordinator for my supposed insolence. I did not even break my stride or turn my head. The scalding coffee had soaked completely through my light silk blouse, leaving a blistering, agonizing red mark across my chest and stomach. The physical pain was sharp and undeniable, radiating with every step I took. Yet the burning sensation registered in my brain as nothing more than a faint, distant annoyance. My mind was entirely consumed by the digital war I was about to wage. I bypassed the main elevators and stepped out onto a secluded, shaded terrace overlooking the private cabanas. The morning air was thick with heavy tropical humidity, but my veins ran with pure, absolute ice. I found a quiet corner shielded by heavy palm fronds and sat down on a wrought iron bench. I pulled out my phone and bypassed the standard biometric security, entering a complex 32-character alphanumeric passcode to access my primary banking terminal. This was not the basic joint checking account Connor obsessively monitored to maintain his fragile ego. This was the highly secure top-tier financial hub connected directly to my private limited liability company. However, linked to this master profile was the platinum credit line I had established shortly after our wedding. Connor proudly carried a shiny metal card with his name printed on the front, but he was merely an authorized user. I was the sole legal guarantor. Every single dollar he spent to project the grand image of a wildly successful, unstoppable tech chief executive officer was backed entirely by my pristine credit score and my silent monthly payments. He operated under the delusion that his logistics startup drew enough investor capital to sustain his lavish lifestyle. In reality, I had been quietly subsidizing his arrogance for years just to keep the peace and observe his genuine nature. I opened the transaction ledger for the platinum card. The screen populated with a dizzying array of recent charges. There were the expected frivolous expenses, exorbitant room service bills, premium imported liquor purchases, and overpriced luxury spa treatments for his mother and his sister. But I was not looking for his petty everyday indulgences. I filtered the search parameters specifically targeting the unique resort vendor codes I had identified in the underground office the night before. The results materialized on my high-resolution screen, and the sheer audacity of his criminal scheme laid itself bare in stark black and white text. There were 3 new pending authorizations initiated just within the last hour. They were categorized under the vague, unsuspicious labels of Executive Event Services and VIP Hospitality Coordination. The financial amounts were staggering: $12,000, $14,500, $18,000. I cross-referenced the merchant identification numbers embedded deep within the transaction data. They all routed back to a dummy vendor subaccount created within the resort billing system. It was an account managed exclusively by Vanessa. The pieces of their pathetic, desperate puzzle locked together perfectly. Connor was not just paying for fake floral arrangements or non-existent audio-visual equipment to impress his family. He was deliberately maxing out the credit line I guaranteed. He and Vanessa were generating fake corporate invoices, passing them through the legitimate resort payment portal, and funneling the laundered cash directly into their own pockets. The diamond tennis bracelet I had seen sparkling against Vanessa's collarbone earlier that morning suddenly made perfect, sickening sense. Connor was quite literally forcing his wife to purchase high-end jewelry for his mistress under the guise of corporate event expenses. It was a brazen, reckless strategy born out of absolute desperation. His logistics startup was severely hemorrhaging money, his investors were asking aggressive questions, and his creditors were undoubtedly closing in. He desperately needed liquid cash, and he had decided my credit line was his personal, unlimited emergency fund. I stared at the glowing numbers on my screen. They truly thought I was a naive, oblivious housewife who simply paid the bills without ever checking the itemized statements. They thought they had discovered a brilliant, untraceable loophole to drain my resources and fund their romantic escape to Miami. What they had actually done was hand me a neatly documented, digitally stamped confession to massive financial crimes. A less disciplined woman would have immediately canceled the platinum card. She would have called the bank, aggressively reported the fraud, and confronted her husband with the undeniable evidence, screaming and demanding an explanation. But confronting Connor now would only give him the opportunity to panic, to destroy the digital evidence, or to concoct a manipulative lie to gaslight me into doubting my own sanity. I did not want to merely stop him from spending my money. I wanted to legally annihilate him. I navigated to the advanced security settings within the banking application. I did not press the button to deactivate the card entirely. Instead, I initiated a highly specific, targeted security protocol. I flagged the 3 massive event services transactions and placed them under a strict temporary administrative freeze. To Connor and Vanessa, the payments would appear as pending processing on their end, giving them the false, comforting hope that the massive sum of money was currently on its way to their accounts. In reality, the funds were securely locked in a digital purgatory, completely inaccessible and heavily monitored by bank fraud algorithms. However, I deliberately left the card fully active for standard point-of-sale transactions. Connor could still use it to buy his mother a $500 bottle of wine at dinner tonight. He could still use it to pay for Rachel's ridiculous shopping sprees at the high-end resort boutiques. He would continue to swipe the card with absolute arrogance, completely unaware that his primary financial lifeline was a carefully constructed mirage. By leaving the card active, I was heavily encouraging him to keep trying his luck. I was giving him the exact rope he desperately wanted so he could tie his own inescapable noose. Every single time he attempted to run a new fraudulent invoice through Vanessa's dummy account, he was generating another distinct documented count of credit card fraud. He was actively creating an undeniable pattern of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud across state lines. I locked my phone and slipped it safely back into my pocket. The burn on my chest was still stinging intensely, but it was a remarkably small price to pay. Connor thought he was outsmarting a small-town girl who knew nothing about the real world. He had absolutely no idea he was actively building his own inescapable federal indictment. The tropical heat of the Florida afternoon eventually surrendered to a heavy, humid evening. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple as the sun set over the Atlantic Ocean. I retreated to the velvet sofa in the living room of the penthouse suite, maintaining my role as the outcast. The burn on my chest throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a physical reminder of the sheer cruelty this family was capable of. But I did not tend to the wound. I used the pain to keep my mind sharp and my focus absolute. Through the massive glass doors leading out to the wraparound oceanfront terrace, I could see the soft flickering light of a gas fire pit. Patricia Harrison and Connor were seated around the flames enjoying the cool ocean breeze. They were drinking premium aged scotch poured from a bottle that cost more than most people made in a week. A bottle that, unbeknownst to them, I had ultimately paid for. Rachel and Terrence had gone out for a private dinner, leaving the core family unit alone to discuss their true priorities. I stood up from the sofa and moved silently toward the terrace. I did not step out into the light. I positioned myself in the deep shadows near the heavy silk drapes, perfectly concealed by the darkness of the living room. The sliding glass door was cracked open just enough for the sound of the crashing waves to enter the room, carrying their hushed voices directly to where I stood. Harrison took a slow sip of his drink and leaned forward. The casual, relaxed vacation posture vanished from his shoulders. He looked at Connor with a grim, calculating expression. He lowered his voice, but the acoustic design of the terrace carried every single word to my ears. Harrison stated bluntly that Rachel's boutique clothing store was facing imminent financial collapse. He explained that Rachel had severely mismanaged her inventory, taking out massive high-interest business loans to fund her own lavish lifestyle instead of paying her suppliers. The creditors were threatening to seize the storefront and file a public lawsuit. Harrison stressed that their legacy family name could not be associated with a humiliating public bankruptcy. Patricia nodded in agreement, her face tight with anxiety. She added that Terrence could not be trusted to fix the mess. She complained that Terrence was too strict with his accounting, too rigid in his principles, and would likely force Rachel to declare bankruptcy, just to teach her a lesson in financial responsibility. Patricia insisted that they had to handle the situation internally to protect their daughter from her own husband. Harrison turned his full attention to Connor. He laid out a chilling, predatory strategy with the casual tone of a man ordering a second drink. Harrison instructed his son to leverage the Seattle house. He told Connor that the real estate market in the Pacific Northwest was booming, and the property they lived in held a massive amount of untapped equity. Harrison ordered Connor to trick me into signing a second mortgage agreement by the end of next month. He wanted Connor to extract a minimum of $500,000 in cash wire the funds directly to a shell account to save Rachel's failing business and mask the entire transaction as a tech startup expansion. I stood completely frozen in the shadows, listening to a father teach his son how to systematically defraud his own wife. Connor did not hesitate. He did not express a single ounce of guilt or moral conflict. He let out a dark, arrogant chuckle, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He leaned back in his chair and looked at his parents with a wide, confident grin. Connor told his father to consider the problem already solved. He spoke about me with a level of contempt and disgust that would have broken a weaker woman. He assured Harrison that manipulating me would require absolutely no effort. Connor called me a naive, gullible woman who was so desperate for his affection and so eager to earn Patricia's approval that I would blindly sign any legal document he placed on the kitchen table. He bragged about how easy it was to control me, claiming that I possessed zero financial literacy and would never even think to hire independent legal counsel to review the paperwork. Then Connor revealed the final phase of his master plan. He promised his parents that the second the bank cleared the $500,000 loan, he was going to drain every joint account they shared. He stated with brutal clarity that once the money was secured and transferred to Rachel, he would immediately file for divorce. He laughed as he imagined me fighting off creditors alone in an empty, heavily mortgaged house, completely discarded and financially ruined. Patricia reached out and affectionately patted her son's cheek. She smiled warmly, expressing her profound relief. She told Connor that she had been waiting for this day for years. She confessed that she had always despised my presence in their family, citing my lack of pedigree and my quiet, unrefined demeanor. She praised Connor for finally coming to his senses and devising a strategy to extract my resources before throwing me back into the gutter where I belonged. I absorbed their horrific conspiracy without moving a single muscle. The sheer delusion of their conversation was almost comical. They were meticulously plotting to steal equity from a property that Connor did not even own. They operated under the false assumption that because the Seattle house was purchased after our wedding, it was considered joint marital property under state law. They were entirely unaware of the lethal legal trap I had set years ago. I had purchased that house, utilizing funds exclusively transferred from my private inheritance trust. Furthermore, I had exploited a very specific ironclad clause buried deep within the 50-page prenuptial agreement Connor had hurriedly signed without consulting a competent lawyer. That clause explicitly designated any real estate acquired with my trust funds as my sole and separate property, completely immune to any marital claims or joint debt obligations. Connor could not take out a mortgage on that house. He could not leverage it. He could not even legally change the locks. His entire master plan was built on a foundation of legal ignorance and blinding arrogance. As I stood in the darkness calculating the exact timeline of when I would drop the legal hammer on his pathetic life, a sudden shift in the air broke my concentration. A tall, imposing shadow detached itself from the corridor leading to the guest bedrooms. I almost gasped, but I forced myself to remain completely silent. The figure moved with practiced, deliberate silence across the plush carpet. A large, warm hand gently rested on my shoulder. I turned my head slightly. It was Terrence. He had returned early from his dinner with Rachel. His face was a mask of stoic professional composure, but his dark eyes burned with an intense, quiet fury. He had clearly been standing in the hallway listening to the exact same conversation. He had heard Patricia insult him. He had heard Harrison plot to hide Rachel's financial crimes from him. He had heard Connor outline his predatory scheme to destroy me. Terrence did not speak a single word. He did not need to. We were both standing in the dark watching the people we had married reveal themselves as absolute monsters. Terrence slowly withdrew his hand from my shoulder. He reached into the tailored pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of hotel stationery. He pressed the paper firmly into my palm, his fingers wrapping around mine for a brief second of undeniable solidarity. He gave me one final knowing look before turning around and disappearing silently back into the shadows of the hallway. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the quiet hum of the resort basement. The office was a masterclass in understated power, featuring dark walnut paneling, minimalist leather furniture, and walls lined with architectural blueprints of the property. Standing rigidly beside the massive executive desk was Mr. Caldwell, the seasoned general manager of the Coral Keys Resort. He had been expecting my arrival since the moment my secure keycard bypassed the lobby elevators. As soon as I stepped onto the plush carpet, he immediately bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. "Welcome back, Madam Chairman," he said, his voice steady and strictly professional. I offered a polite nod and walked around the desk, taking my seat in the high-backed leather executive chair. The contrast between my current reality and the velvet sofa I had just been banished to upstairs was almost poetic. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence of the room center my mind. 3 years ago, this very resort was drowning in Chapter 11, bankruptcy, crippled by poor management and toxic debts. While Connor was busy burning through venture capital and pretending to be a tech visionary in the public eye, I had quietly utilized my private family office trust to acquire 85% of the property for pennies on the dollar. I kept the acquisition entirely anonymous, shielded by layers of limited liability companies and strict non-disclosure agreements drafted by top-tier corporate attorneys. Connor always believed my investments were small, negligible side projects meant to pass the time. He had absolutely no idea he was currently vacationing in my house, sleeping under my roof, and disrespecting the majority shareholder of the very ground he walked on. I instructed Mr. Caldwell to hand over the latest financial dossiers. He slid a sleek silver tablet across the desk already unlocked and synced directly to the secure internal accounting mainframe. I needed to see exactly what Connor was doing with his supposedly unlimited birthday budget. My eyes scanned the digital ledgers tracking the rapid sequence of charges applied to the penthouse suite over the last few hours. The sheer volume of his spending was pathetic but entirely predictable. He had already wasted thousands of dollars on vintage champagne imported caviar and extravagant spa packages for Patricia and Rachel. He was using my shared marital credit line to fund his desperate illusion of wealth. However, as I scrolled deeper into the event planning subfolders, my trained eyes caught a glaring anomaly. There were 4 highly suspicious transactions logged under a vendor code I did not recognize. Each charge was for exactly $9,500, deliberately kept just under the $10,000 threshold that would automatically trigger federal banking alerts. They were billed as custom floral arrangements and premium audiovisual equipment rentals for a non-existent private gala. I tapped the screen to expand the digital receipts. The authorizing signature on the requests belonged to Connor. The employee processing these massive fraudulent charges was listed as an event coordinator. I cross-referenced the employee identification number with the Human Resources database. The screen populated with a profile picture of a 28-year-old woman named Vanessa. She was the same event coordinator I had noticed hovering around the main lobby earlier that afternoon, offering Connor overly eager smiles while ignoring the rest of the family. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, feeling a cold, calculating clarity wash over me. Connor was not just spending my money to look rich. He was actively conspiring with a resort employee to generate fake invoices. They were effectively laundering money straight from my marital credit accounts into his own pocket, or worse, into a hidden offshore account they shared. This was textbook wire fraud and corporate embezzlement happening right under my nose. I needed visual confirmation to seal the trap. I opened the live security surveillance application on the tablet. The Coral Keys Resort is equipped with state-of-the-art high-definition cameras covering every inch of the property, carefully positioned to protect high-net-worth guests. I brought up the security grid and began filtering the live feeds. I skipped the bustling main lobby, the grand dining room, and the casino floor. I focused my search on the secluded late-night areas restricted from general access. I clicked on the feed for the South Cabana Pool, a luxurious section of the resort strictly closed for maintenance until the following morning. The high-definition night vision camera sprang to life on my screen. The pool area was dark, illuminated only by underwater LED lights, and completely deserted, except for 2 figures standing near the edge of the water. I zoomed in on the figures. It was Connor. He was not in his luxury suite conducting vital overseas business meetings, as Patricia had loudly and proudly claimed to the entire family. He was pressing Vanessa against a decorative stone pillar, his hands roaming freely over her resort uniform. They were kissing passionately, completely reckless, and consumed by their own arrogance. The security system in this specific high-roller area included ambient audio recording for liability purposes. I tapped the volume icon and turned it up just enough to hear the crystal-clear audio feed flooding into the quiet office. Connor pulled away from Vanessa for a brief second, laughing softly as he stroked her hair. He told her she was an absolute genius for figuring out how to bypass the accounting software to process the fake invoices without alerting the finance department. Vanessa giggled, tracing her manicured fingers down his chest. She looked up at him with greedy eyes and asked him how much longer she had to wait before he finally got rid of his boring, useless wife. Connor kissed her neck and confidently promised that their waiting game was almost over. He swore to Vanessa that the second he drained the last drop of equity from the Seattle house, he was going to cut loose his country bumpkin wife and leave her with absolutely nothing. He promised they would take the laundered cash file for immediate divorce and move into a luxury loft in Miami where they belonged. I stared at the glowing screen. A normal woman might have cried, screamed, or thrown the expensive tablet across the room in a fit of betrayed rage. But I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow. I felt an icy, terrifying calm settle deep into my bones. Connor had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him legally, financially, and socially. I locked the tablet screen and handed it back to Mr. Caldwell. I instructed him to quietly compile every single piece of documentary evidence regarding the fake invoices and burn a pristine copy of the security footage to an encrypted external drive. The game had officially begun. The resort was entirely silent by the time the grandfather clock in the main lobby chimed 2 in the morning. The ambient low-level lighting of the Azure Lounge cast long dramatic shadows across the polished mahogany floors. I bypassed the closed entrance signs and walked into the deserted bar. I found Terrence sitting in the furthest corner booth, largely hidden from the main walkway. A glass of dark bourbon sat untouched on the table in front of him. He looked up as I approached. His posture was rigid, the ever-present analytical corporate auditor finally off the clock and ready to drop the polite facade. I slid into the heavy leather booth across from him. Neither of us bothered to order a drink or make small talk. We did not need alcohol, we needed strategy. Terrence did not waste a single second. He unzipped a sleek leather portfolio and slid a thick stack of printed financial spreadsheets across the table. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany wood, and instructed me to look closely at the highlighted columns. As a senior corporate auditor, Terrence had spent his entire professional career dismantling complex, fraudulent financial structures. He had applied that exact ruthless surgical precision to Connor's supposedly booming tech empire. The numbers printed on the pages were utterly catastrophic. Terrence kept his voice low but completely steady. He explained that Connor's logistics startup was not just failing under poor management. It was a deliberately constructed, completely hollow shell company. Terrence pointed to a series of offshore transfers, detailing how Connor had been forging user acquisition metrics and inflating gross merchandise value reports to illegally secure his last 2 rounds of venture capital funding. The monthly burn rate was astronomical. Connor was currently over $4 million in debt, possessing 0 liquid assets. Even worse, Terrence had uncovered severe irregularities in the payroll tax filings. Connor was facing imminent federal tax evasion charges that would inevitably trigger a massive destructive investigation by the Internal Revenue Service. But Terrence did not stop at Connor. He turned the page, revealing highly sensitive personal bank statements belonging to his own wife. He stated with a terrifyingly calm, deadpan voice that Rachel was no better than her brother. She had been secretly siphoning tens of thousands of dollars from their joint marital savings accounts to artificially inflate the revenue of her failing local boutique. She had been actively forging monthly bank statements to hide the massive financial bleeding from him. Terrence tapped his index finger against the paper, declaring that he had spent the last 3 months compiling a bulletproof portfolio of absolute financial misconduct. He had the divorce papers drafted, finalized, and completely ready to file the exact moment they returned from this miserable birthday trip. Terrence leaned back against the leather booth. The professional, calculated mask slipped just enough to reveal the deep, exhausted anger burning underneath. He looked at me, his dark eyes reflecting years of suppressed humiliation. Terrence spoke about the relentless, suffocating reality of being a black man married into this specific breed of wealthy, highly entitled family. He detailed the endless psychological microaggressions he endured daily. He described the way Patricia would introduce him to her elite country club friends, never by his professional title, but by emphasizing his diversity, as if he were a charitable tax write-off she had acquired to make the family look progressive. He recounted the way Harrison would loudly question his financial advice at the dinner table, subtly implying that a man of his background could not possibly comprehend the complexities of generational wealth. Rachel never defended him. She simply told him to stop being so sensitive and to just play along with her parents to keep the peace. He confessed that for years he thought he had to endure their thinly veiled racism just to honor his marriage vows. But discovering her financial betrayal was the absolute final straw. They treated him like a second-class citizen while actively stealing the money he worked grueling 80-hour weeks to earn. I listened to every single word without interrupting. I absorbed the full, crushing weight of his anger because I shared that exact same frequency of quiet, calculating rage. When he finally finished speaking, the silence between us felt heavy, but incredibly clarifying. We were the collateral damage of their narcissism. We were the outsiders they thought they could bleed dry without any consequence. I looked directly at Terrence, dropping my obedient, quiet housewife facade completely. I told him he was the smartest man in their entire family, which was exactly why they constantly tried to make him feel small. They were terrified of his intelligence. I reached into my own jacket. I did not bring spreadsheets. I brought highly classified, legally binding contracts. I smoothly pushed a thick, heavily bound folder across the table toward him. I told him he was not alone in this fight. I instructed him to open the first tab. Terrence frowned slightly, adjusting his posture as he began to read the dense legal jargon. I explained the mechanics of the devastating trap I had set. I told him about the prenuptial agreement Connor had demanded I sign 5 years ago. Connor was so arrogant, so eager to protect his imaginary future billions, that he had merely skimmed the 50-page document before signing it. He completely missed the severability clause I had my corporate lawyers bury on page 34. That specific ironclad clause dictated that any real estate purchased utilizing my private separate trust funds remained entirely mine, completely shielded from any marital property claims in our home state. I watched Terrence's eyes widen as he read the updated title deed to the Seattle house. I informed him that the property had already been legally transferred to a blind limited liability company that I exclusively controlled. Connor could not leverage a single brick of that house to save Rachel's boutique because his name was no longer anywhere on the deed. He had zero equity to steal. Terrence looked up from the document, sheer disbelief warring with absolute professional respect on his face. He whispered that Connor was going to end up entirely homeless and facing federal prison time. I offered a cold, razor-sharp smile. I told Terrence that homelessness was just the beginning of Connor's nightmare. I instructed him to turn to the very last page in the folder. Terrence flipped the thick parchment paper over. It was a certified corporate ownership registry, heavily stamped by the State Financial Board. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I asked him if he knew who actually owned the Coral Keys Resort, the very ground his arrogant mother-in-law was currently sleeping on. Terrence scanned the document, his breath audibly caught in his throat. He read the name of the majority shareholder holding 85% of the total equity. He looked from the official legal paper directly to me, absolute shock paralyzing his features. He was looking at my name. The third day of this wretched vacation arrived with a punishing, suffocating heat wave. The Florida sun beat down mercilessly, pushing the temperature well past 104 degrees. The ocean air offered zero relief, hanging thick and heavy over the pristine white sands of the private beach. Despite the extreme weather, Patricia insisted on hosting a massive outdoor barbecue at the ultra-exclusive beachfront pavilion. This was not a casual family lunch. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical performance designed purely to inflate her own ego and project an illusion of generational wealth to the local high society. She had spent the entire morning networking at the country club, inviting a curated selection of affluent locals, wealthy retirees, and regional socialites to our private cabana. Patricia found me in the kitchen before the first guest even arrived. She threw a heavy, coarse canvas apron directly at my chest. She commanded me to handle the grilling station, claiming that the resort chefs were too slow and that my working-class background made me perfectly suited for manual labor over open flames. She ordered me to stand over the massive industrial grill, managing the thick cuts of Wagyu beef and lobster tails, completely exposed to the blistering afternoon sun. I tied the apron strings behind my back without a single word of protest. The intense heat of the roaring grill seared my skin, mixing with the already suffocating humidity, but I embraced the physical discomfort. Every drop of sweat was a sharp reminder of the financial execution I was meticulously preparing for them. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the pavilion was swarming with Patricia's newly acquired audience. Wealthy women in designer resort wear and men wearing expensive linen shirts mingled around the shaded bar area, sipping chilled champagne and laughing loudly. I stood 50 feet away, shrouded in a thick cloud of charcoal smoke, flipping steaks with a heavy pair of metal tongs. Patricia held court in the center of the pavilion, her voice carrying easily over the ambient tropical music. She eagerly introduced Connor to every passing guest, loudly proclaiming him to be a visionary tech billionaire. She bragged about his massive logistics startup, inventing wild statistics about his supposed global expansion and recent venture capital acquisitions. Connor soaked up the adulation, perfectly swirling a glass of expensive scotch and spinning elaborate lies about his upcoming initial public offering. He played the part of the exhausted, brilliant chief executive officer, seeking a brief respite from his grueling corporate empire. Harrison stood right beside his son, vigorously nodding and validating every single fraudulent claim. Terrence sat quietly at a corner table, nursing a glass of sparkling water. He wore a perfectly tailored linen suit, his posture rigid and observant. He watched the entire grotesque display with a cold, analytical eye. Whenever Patricia or Rachel looked away, Terrence would catch my gaze through the thick smoke of the grill. We shared a silent, profound understanding. We were the only two people on this entire beach who knew that the golden child holding the scotch glass was actually a financial corpse carrying $4 million in toxic debt. The sheer audacity of my mother-in-law knew absolutely no bounds. A wealthy older woman draped in pearls noticed me standing alone at the grill and asked Patricia if I was part of the catering staff. Patricia let out a loud, ringing laugh that grated against my ears. She deliberately pitched her voice so that everyone nearby could hear her cruel response. Patricia stated that I was just the unfortunate, unrefined wife her brilliant son had taken pity on. She called me a simple-minded girl who was much better suited for kitchen duties than intellectual conversations. To prove her dominance, Patricia snapped her manicured fingers in my direction. She ordered me to leave the grill and fetch a fresh bucket of ice for the raw oyster bar, commanding me to hurry up because her guests were getting thirsty. I calmly set down the metal tongs. I wiped my hands on the coarse canvas apron, maintaining a perfectly blank, obedient facial expression. I walked past the laughing guests, retrieved the heavy silver ice bucket, and carried it back to the display table. Connor did not even look at me as I passed him. He was completely engrossed in impressing a local real estate developer, acting as if the woman carrying a heavy bucket of ice in the blistering heat was completely invisible to him. He allowed his mother to publicly degrade his wife, treating me like an indentured servant whose sole purpose was to facilitate his grand illusion of luxury. I poured the fresh ice over the expensive seafood, offering Patricia a polite, hollow nod before returning to my post at the sweltering grill. Let them laugh, I thought to myself. Let them build their arrogant pedestal as high as possible. The higher they climb, the more devastating the impact will be when I completely shatter the foundation. Just as the afternoon heat reached its absolute peak, a sudden shift in the crowd's attention caught my eye. The ambient chatter in the pavilion quieted for a brief second. I looked up from the searing flames and wiped a bead of sweat from my forehead. Walking down the pristine wooden boardwalk toward our private pavilion was Vanessa. The resort event coordinator had shed her standard corporate uniform. She was dressed in a stunning pure white silk sundress that clung perfectly to her figure. Her hair was styled in immaculate cascading waves, and she carried a designer clutch that easily cost $5,000. She radiated an intoxicating, predatory confidence, walking directly into a private family gathering as if she completely owned the space. Connor immediately broke away from his conversation with the real estate developer. His eyes lit up with undeniable lust and arrogant pride. He walked straight up to Vanessa and smoothly wrapped his arm around her slender waist in front of the entire assembly of high society guests. He loudly introduced her to the crowd as a highly esteemed corporate consultant and his absolute guest of honor for the weekend festivities. Patricia immediately rushed forward to greet the mistress, offering Vanessa a warm, enthusiastic embrace. She ushered the young woman toward the premium shaded seating, commanding a waiter to bring her a glass of the finest champagne. The blatant, sickening reality of their conspiracy was unfolding right in front of my face. The entire family was actively participating in the public humiliation of their own daughter-in-law, welcoming the woman who was helping Connor destroy my life. But my eyes were not focused on Vanessa's triumphant, gloating smile as she glanced over at me sweating behind the industrial grill. My eyes were entirely locked onto her neck. Resting perfectly against her collarbone, catching the brilliant Florida sunlight and scattering tiny prisms of light across the pavilion, was a massive custom-designed diamond tennis necklace. It was an unmistakable, breathtaking piece of high-end jewelry. I recognized it instantly. It was the exact same piece of jewelry that had triggered a massive fraud alert on my private banking terminal just 4 hours earlier. It was the necklace Connor had purchased by filtering a fraudulent corporate event invoice through the resort accounting system. He had stolen $18,000 from my credit line this very morning just to clasp those diamonds around the neck of his mistress. Vanessa caught my stare. She reached up with a manicured hand and slowly, deliberately traced her fingers along the glittering diamonds. She offered me a sweet, utterly poisonous smile, her eyes dancing with pure malice and victorious mockery. She truly believed she had won the ultimate prize. I stood motionless behind the roaring flames of the grill. I did not drop my tongs. I did not scream. I felt a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. The trap was now fully loaded, and they had just handed me the final undeniable piece of physical evidence required to execute their absolute destruction. The blistering afternoon heat continued to bake the beachfront pavilion thick with the scent of charred Wagyu beef and expensive sunscreen. I maintained my position behind the industrial grill, using the roaring flames as a physical barrier between myself and the grotesque theater of my in-laws. Wealthy local socialites and regional investors mingled around the open bar, their loud laughter echoing over the crashing waves. Connor was in his element, holding a glass of aged scotch and commanding the attention of 3 regional real estate developers. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime, projecting the image of a fearless, untouchable tech titan. I watched him excuse himself from the group of affluent men. His arrogant, confident posture shifted into something entirely manufactured as he walked toward me. He retrieved a sleek leather portfolio from a nearby table, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory focus masked by a bright, completely fake smile. He wanted to secure his stolen funds, and he wanted to do it right here in front of his elite audience, where he knew I would be socially pressured into absolute submission. Connor stepped up to the grill, ignoring the intense heat radiating from the hot coals. He wrapped one arm around my waist in a disgusting show of public affection. To the wealthy guests watching us, we looked like the perfect supportive couple sharing a brief romantic moment during a lavish party. But his fingers dug sharply into my side, a silent, aggressive command to obey. He flipped open the leather portfolio and placed it directly onto a small stainless steel prep table next to the grill. Inside rested a thick stack of legal documents neatly tabbed with bright yellow sticky notes, indicating exactly where my signature was required. He pulled a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket and held it out to me. "Sign this business permit for me, honey," he said, his voice dripping with artificial sweetness engineered to carry just far enough for the nearby investors to hear. "I am busy entertaining guests, and my legal team needs these expansion authorizations finalized before the banking cutoff time today." I looked down at the thick stack of papers. My eyes instantly bypassed his verbal lies and focused on the dense, formatted legal text. It was not a business permit. It was not a corporate expansion authorization. It was a comprehensive, legally binding home equity line of credit application. It was a secondary mortgage agreement specifically targeting the Seattle property. Connor had meticulously filled out the financial request for exactly $500,000, leaving only the primary guarantor signature line blank. He was attempting to weaponize the social pressure of this high society barbecue to force me into signing away my home without giving me a single second to read the fine print. I did not reach for the pen immediately. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting on the metal tongs. The silence between us stretched for a fraction of a second too long. Connor's fake smile began to strain at the edges. His eyes hardened silently, demanding immediate compliance. Before he could apply more pressure, Patricia materialized beside us. She had been monitoring the transaction from the central bar, clutching her crystal champagne flute like a weapon. She glided over with practiced elegance, projecting the image of a helpful, loving mother-in-law. But as she leaned in close, her expensive floral perfume failing to mask the bitter toxicity of her intent, her voice dropped to a harsh, venomous whisper. "What is taking so long?" Patricia hissed, her face frozen in a terrifyingly pleasant smile for the sake of the surrounding guests. "Stop being so difficult and sign the document. Your husband is conducting massive high-level corporate negotiations right now. You are holding up millions of dollars in business because you are too slow to write your own name. Do not make a scene and do not embarrass this family in front of these important people. Just sign the paper so Connor can get back to his actual responsibilities." She reached out and forcefully pushed the gold pen against my palm, her sharp fingernails digging into my skin. She was attempting to bulldoze my free will, relying on my historical obedience and my working-class fear of creating a public disturbance among the wealthy elite. They both truly believed I was nothing more than a terrified, uneducated girl who would eagerly sign her own financial death warrant just to avoid a scolding at a family barbecue. I slowly shifted my gaze away from Patricia and looked across the crowded pavilion. Seated in the premium shaded lounge area, resting on a plush white cushion, was Vanessa. The event coordinator turned mistress was watching the exchange with rapt attention. Her hand casually rested against her collarbone, her fingers lightly tracing the $18,000 diamond tennis necklace Connor had stolen from me just hours prior. When she saw me looking at her, a wide, triumphant smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She took a slow sip of her champagne, her eyes gleaming with victorious mockery. She fully believed this was the final devastating blow. She thought she was watching the exact moment I surrendered my last remaining asset to fund her new luxurious life in Miami. Standing a few yards behind Vanessa, perfectly still against a decorative stone pillar, was Terrence. His tailored linen suit looked crisp, but his posture was coiled with intense, suppressed anxiety. His dark eyes were locked entirely on me. He had read the audit reports. He knew exactly what those documents meant. He was watching a woman being cornered by a family of financial predators, holding his breath, silently waiting to see if I possessed the absolute ruthless strength required to execute the trap we had discussed in the dark corners of the resort bar. The tropical heat felt entirely irrelevant now. The roaring flames of the grill faded into background noise. I looked at the gold-plated pen resting in my palm. I looked at Connor, whose arrogant, expectant face was inches from mine. I looked at Patricia, who was glaring at me with unfiltered hatred. I looked at Vanessa, basking in her stolen diamonds. I slowly reached out and took the heavy gold pen from Connor's hand. Connor let out a very soft, arrogant sigh of relief. His shoulders relaxed. He believed he had won. Patricia smirked, adjusting her designer sunglasses, already turning her back on me to return to her wealthy friends. I gripped the pen tightly. I looked down at the signature line on the fraudulent $500,000 mortgage application. I raised my hand and slowly, deliberately placed the tip of the pen directly against the thick parchment paper. The blistering afternoon heat radiating from the industrial grill was nothing compared to the intense, suffocating tension surrounding the small stainless steel prep table. I held the heavy gold-plated fountain pen against the thick parchment of the home equity application. The ink did not flow. I did not let it. The Florida sun beat down on my shoulders, but a freezing, absolute calm had completely taken over my nervous system. Connor exhaled a soft, premature breath of victory right next to my ear. He was already calculating how fast he could wire the $500,000 to Rachel's failing boutique and Vanessa's offshore accounts. He leaned his weight slightly against the table, his posture radiating the smug satisfaction of a predator who believed his prey had willingly walked into the slaughterhouse. From the corner of my eye, I saw Vanessa shift on her plush white cushion. The event coordinator turned mistress leaned forward eagerly, her manicured fingers tightly clutching the stem of her champagne flute. She was waiting for the exact second my signature finalized her luxurious future in Miami. Across the pavilion, Terence stood perfectly still against the decorative stone pillar. He was the only person in this entire resort who knew the financial guillotine suspended directly above Connor's neck. Terrence's dark eyes were locked onto my hands, his sharp, analytical mind calculating the precise fallout of the explosion I was about to trigger. I lifted the tip of the pen away from the signature line. Connor frowned, his fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, impatient whisper, demanding that I stop wasting time and sign the document before his investors lost interest. I did not look at him. Instead, I gripped the heavy, expensive fountain pen with both of my hands. I placed my thumbs firmly against the center of the polished gold casing. With a sudden, violent, and highly deliberate motion, I snapped the pen in half. The sharp, brutal crack of the metal breaking echoed surprisingly loud over the ambient music and the sizzling of the charcoal grill. The expensive ink cartridge inside ruptured instantly. Thick, dark ink spilled over my fingers and dripped directly onto the fraudulent $500,000 mortgage application, completely ruining the pristine legal document Connor had spent weeks preparing. I let the two broken, jagged halves of the gold pen fall from my hands. They clattered onto the stainless steel table. The silence that descended upon our immediate circle was absolute and deafening. The three regional real estate developers standing a few yards away stopped their conversation mid-sentence, their drinks halfway to their mouths, staring at the sudden display of destruction. Vanessa gasped loudly from her cabana, spilling her champagne onto her white silk dress. Terence did not move a single muscle, but I saw the faint, triumphant tension release from his broad shoulders. Connor stared at the ruined paperwork, his face completely drained of color. His jaw dropped, his brain struggling to comprehend the defiant, destructive act committed by the woman he had spent years treating like an obedient doormat. He looked from the shattered pen to my ink-stained hands and finally up to my face. I met his terrified, confused gaze with eyes devoid of any warmth or submission. My voice was incredibly calm, perfectly modulated and loud enough for the nearby wealthy investors to hear every single syllable. "I cannot sign for something I no longer own, Connor." The words hung in the suffocating tropical air like a physical blow. I watched his mind frantically scramble to process the legal implication of my statement. He knew he had purchased that house in Seattle after our wedding. He assumed community property laws guaranteed him 50% equity. He had absolutely no idea that my private limited liability company had legally absorbed the entire estate weeks ago, entirely shielding it from his fraudulent reach. Connor's survival instincts kicked in. He was a cornered rat, terrified of losing his wealthy facade in front of the local high society. His face flushed a dark, angry red, but he violently forced a loud, booming, entirely artificial laugh from his chest. He turned toward the staring real estate developers, waving his hands in a frantic, dismissive gesture. He loudly proclaimed that his wife had a terrible, eccentric sense of humor. He told the wealthy guests that the intense Florida heat was clearly getting to my head and making me act out of sorts. He forced another booming laugh, assuring everyone that it was just a silly marital prank and that everything was perfectly under control. The developers exchanged highly uncomfortable glances, clearly not buying the pathetic performance, and slowly backed away toward the open bar to distance themselves from the escalating domestic dispute. The second the investors were out of earshot, the fake smile vanished entirely from Connor's face, replaced by pure, unfiltered rage. He lunged forward and grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug viciously into my skin, gripping me with enough force to leave deep bruises. He yanked me roughly toward his chest, his breath hot and ragged against my face. "Do not do anything crazy here!" he hissed, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, venomous panic. "You are making me look like a fool. You are going to sign a fresh copy of that application right now, or I swear I will make your life a living hell." He thought physical intimidation would break my resolve. He thought the fear of a public scandal would force me back into submission. He was entirely wrong. I did not flinch. I did not try to pull away. I simply looked down at the hand bruising my arm, and then I looked directly into his eyes. The sheer terrifying emptiness of my stare made him physically recoil. His grip loosened just a fraction of an inch, unnerved by the absolute absence of fear in a woman he thought he controlled. I smoothly and forcefully ripped my arm out of his grasp, stepping back to establish a perimeter of total dominance. Before Connor could attempt to grab me again, the sharp, aggressive clicking of designer heels against the wooden boardwalk shattered the tension. Patricia had witnessed the entire exchange from the central bar. The broken pen, the spilled ink, the public embarrassment of her golden child in front of the elite country club members she had spent all morning impressing. The illusion of her perfect aristocratic family was actively burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. Patricia lost every single ounce of her refined high society facade. She marched across the pavilion with the fury of a woman unhinged. Her face was contorted with pure ugly rage. She shoved past a waiter, nearly knocking him over, and stopped inches away from me. She stood up abruptly from her manufactured grace, her chest heaving with indignation. She raised her hand and pointed her manicured diamond-ringed finger directly into my face. The absolute unbridled fury radiating from her eyes signaled that the delicate, polite war was over. Her explosive wrath was about to ignite the devastating climax of the entire story. Patricia's voice shattered the delicate ambiance of the beachfront pavilion like a glass bottle smashed against a marble floor. The sheer volume of her screeching demand instantly silenced the ambient tropical music and halted every single conversation within a 50-foot radius. She stood mere inches from my face, her chest heaving with unrestrained, ugly indignation. The carefully crafted illusion of a refined, aristocratic matriarch evaporated completely, leaving behind nothing but a bitter, deeply insecure woman desperate to assert her dominance over someone she deemed socially inferior. "What exactly do you think you are doing with that attitude?" Patricia screamed, her manicured finger jabbing aggressively through the air toward my chest. Her face was flushed a dark mottled red, the veins in her neck standing out against her heavy diamond necklace. She pointed violently at the ink-stained, ruined mortgage application resting on the stainless steel table. "Sign a fresh copy of that document right this instant. I will not stand here and allow you to publicly disrespect my son after everything this family has done to elevate you from your pathetic working-class existence." I maintained my silence, absorbing the barrage of her verbal assault without a single flinch. My lack of a terrified response only fueled her rage further. Patricia took another step forward, entirely disregarding the intense heat radiating from the industrial grill. She wanted to break me. She wanted to see me crumble, cry, and beg for forgiveness in front of her affluent country club friends. "In this house, you are nothing but a parasite." Patricia continued, her voice echoing off the wooden rafters of the pavilion. "You contribute absolutely nothing to Connor's massive success. You drain his resources, you embarrass us with your utter lack of sophistication, and you stubbornly refuse to support his brilliant business ventures. You are a freeloader who managed to trap a successful man, and I am entirely sick of pretending that you belong in our world." The affluent guests standing around the open bar were completely frozen in shock. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased entirely. Wealthy local real estate developers, regional socialites, and elite investors stared at the unfolding domestic execution with morbid, horrified fascination. Nobody dared to intervene. The social rules of the ultra-rich dictated that they simply watch the spectacle in silence. Patricia was not finished. She needed to deliver the ultimate crushing blow to ensure my complete psychological destruction. She looked at the small, simple plate of salad I had prepared for myself earlier, which was currently resting near the edge of the prep table. She then pointed a sharp, furious finger toward a tiny, isolated folding table situated far away from the main lounge, right next to the discreet trash receptacles designated for the catering staff. "Take that pathetic plate of salad and go sit over there in the corner," Patricia commanded, her tone dripping with absolute unfiltered venom. "Get out of the sight of our esteemed guests." You are completely ruining the aesthetic of my birthday celebration. The help does not get to sit at the same table with the family." The cruelty of her statement hung suspended in the heavy, humid tropical air. Calling your own daughter-in-law a maid and banishing her to eat next to the garbage bins in front of dozens of high society strangers was a level of social degradation designed to cause permanent, irreparable emotional trauma. I slowly shifted my gaze away from Patricia and scanned the faces of my so-called family. Connor stood right behind his mother, his arms crossed casually over his chest. He did not look embarrassed by his mother's unhinged public outburst. He looked supremely vindicated. A dark, arrogant smirk played at the corners of his mouth. He was immensely proud of Patricia for doing his dirty work. He truly believed that this public verbal lashing would finally break my spirit and force me to sign away the Seattle house just to escape the relentless humiliation. A few yards away, lounging on a premium shaded sofa, Rachel let out a sharp, cruel laugh. The sound cut clearly through the silence of the pavilion. She took a slow, elegant sip of her mimosa, thoroughly enjoying the live entertainment. She leaned over and whispered a malicious joke to a nearby guest, clearly mocking my ruined, ink-stained hands and my current social crucifixion. She viewed my degradation as the perfect highlight to her luxurious vacation. Then there was Vanessa. The mistress stood near the edge of the cabana, fully draped in her white silk dress and the stolen $18,000 diamond necklace. She placed a delicate manicured hand over her chest in a masterclass performance of theatrical fake sympathy. She let out a soft dramatic sigh, shaking her head slowly from side to side. She adopted the facial expression of an angel looking down with profound pity on a wretched, pathetic creature. She wanted everyone to see how gracious and refined she was, compared to the clumsy, hysterical, unhinged wife who was currently being banished to the trash bins. Standing deep in the shadows of the pavilion, Terence remained perfectly rigid. His dark eyes never left my face. He was a silent sentinel, watching the ticking clock of this horrific family dynamic reach its final explosive second. He knew the devastating financial artillery I possessed, and he was holding his breath, waiting for me to pull the trigger. Everyone in that pavilion expected a specific reaction from me. They expected the working-class girl to shatter. They expected me to burst into violent, humiliated tears. They expected me to drop my head in shame, cover my face, and run sobbing out of the pavilion, leaving Connor free to play the role of the exhausted, long-suffering husband to the sympathetic crowd. I did absolutely none of those things. My heart rate was steady beating with the calm, rhythmic precision of a predator whose prey had finally walked completely into the steel cage. The burning sensation from the spilled coffee on my chest faded into total insignificance. The heat of the afternoon sun felt like a spotlight specifically aimed at this confrontation. The ocean waves crashing against the pristine shoreline provided a rhythmic, relentless soundtrack to the ultimate standoff. Patricia's chest continued to heave, her breath hissing out in short, angry bursts as she waited for my total submission. She wanted the immediate gratification of watching me shuffle away to the trash bins like a beaten dog. Connor shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his smirk widening as he anticipated the final collapse of my dignity. I looked down at the small ceramic plate of salad resting on the stainless steel table. I reached out with slow, steady, entirely deliberate hands. I grasped the edges of the white plate and picked it up. I did not cry. I did not run. I did not utter a single word of defense or apology. I took one slow, measured step backward, distancing myself from the intense heat of the industrial grill. Holding the plate perfectly level in my left hand, I raised my right hand and firmly grasped the edge of the coarse canvas apron tied around my waist. I ran my palm down the thick fabric, smoothing out every single wrinkle with a terrifying, meticulous precision. I looked straight into Patricia's furious, expectant eyes, maintaining absolute, unblinking eye contact as the silence in the pavilion stretched to the breaking point. I allowed them to experience their cruel, manufactured victory for just a fraction of a heartbeat longer. I allowed them to bask in their profound arrogance, utterly blind to the fact that they had just sealed their own inescapable, devastating fate. I stood my ground, my posture radiating an icy, unbreakable authority that sent a sudden visible ripple of confusion across Patricia's face. She demanded a broken maid, but she was staring directly at an executioner. The heavy tropical air felt as though it had completely solidified around us. Every pair of eyes in that luxurious beachfront pavilion was locked onto my face. The wealthy local investors, the regional socialites, the waitstaff hovering in the periphery, and my entire arrogant in-law family waited for my total emotional collapse. I stood perfectly still. I did not lower my gaze. I did not shed a single tear of humiliation. Instead, I slowly tightened my grip on the edge of the small ceramic plate holding my meager salad. I lowered the plate back down onto the stainless steel prep table. The soft clink of the ceramic hitting the metal echoed loudly in the deafening silence of the crowd. I raised my head and looked directly into Patricia's furious, expectant eyes. My voice was not a scream. It was not a desperate plea for basic human dignity. It was a smooth, chillingly calm statement of absolute authority. I spoke with the precise, measured cadence of an executioner reading a final verdict. "A maid," I said, letting the offensive word hang in the humid air for a fraction of a second. "Mother, you are absolutely right. The help should not sit here." Patricia let out a sharp, victorious scoff, adjusting her posture to bask in her perceived triumph. Connor smirked, crossing his arms over his chest, thoroughly enjoying my public submission. Vanessa took another sip of her champagne, her eyes glittering with pure malice. But I was not finished. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, entirely closing the physical distance between myself and my mother-in-law. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away every ounce of the obedient daughter-in-law facade I had maintained for 5 long years. "You are entirely correct that a maid does not belong at this table," I continued, ensuring my words carried across the entire pavilion. "But you are mistaken about one fundamental detail." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over Connor, over the stolen diamond necklace resting against Vanessa's skin, and finally back to Patricia. "This is my resort." The words did not immediately register with the audience. The concept was simply too massive, too utterly incomprehensible for their arrogant minds to process. For 3 full seconds, the beachfront pavilion remained trapped in a state of absolute suspended animation. The crashing ocean waves provided the only sound. The wealthy real estate developers standing near the bar exchanged deeply confused glances, their business instincts suddenly warning them that the power dynamic in the room had drastically shifted. Terrence, standing perfectly rigid in the shadows, let out a very slow, almost imperceptible exhale. He knew the devastating financial artillery I had just unleashed. Then the silence shattered. Patricia blinked rapidly, her face twisting into an expression of profound comical bewilderment. She looked at me as if I had suddenly started speaking an ancient forgotten language. She turned her head and looked at Connor, expecting her golden child to immediately shut down my insane delusional outburst. Connor was staring at me with his mouth slightly open. He let out a loud, harsh bark of laughter. It was a nervous, aggressive sound, designed to forcefully reestablish his dominance in front of his elite audience. He shook his head, pointing a finger at me, as if I were a deeply disturbed patient who had wandered out of a psychiatric ward. "Are you out of your mind?" Connor yelled, his voice dripping with defensive condescension. "What is wrong with you? Stop making a fool of yourself in front of these important people." Patricia recovered from her initial shock. The bewilderment on her face instantly morphed into roaring theatrical laughter. She threw her head back, clutching her crystal champagne flute, and laughed with such immense exaggerated force that a few drops of the expensive alcohol spilled onto her designer dress. She turned to her affluent friends, waving her manicured hand in my direction, inviting the entire high society crowd to join in on the mockery. "Are you completely crazy?" Patricia shrieked, tears of mirth actually forming in the corners of her eyes. "Did the heat from that grill finally melt your pathetic little brain?" She stepped closer to me, her voice rising in pitch and volume, ensuring every single guest heard her humiliating rebuttal. "This is an ultra-exclusive high-end luxury resort," Patricia mocked, pointing her finger fiercely at the marble floors beneath our feet. My son, an actual visionary tech billionaire, had to use his massive corporate influence and pay top dollar to book this entire VIP package for my birthday. You are a penniless, uneducated girl from a working-class neighborhood. You do not own a single brick of this establishment. You do not even own the cheap clothes on your back. You are having a complete mental breakdown because you finally realize you will never fit into our world. Rachel chimed in from her shaded sofa, her voice shrill and mocking. She called me a delusional, desperate gold digger who was trying to steal credit for her brother's incredible wealth. Vanessa covered her mouth, giggling audibly from her cabana, thoroughly enjoying my supposed psychological collapse. Harrison stood by the bar, shaking his head in sheer disgust at my behavior. They were all completely blinded by their own towering arrogance. They genuinely believed I was a broken, hysterical housewife grasping at wild, impossible fantasies to protect my shattered ego. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice to defend my statement. I did not pull out property deeds or financial records to prove my ownership. I simply stood there, an anchor of absolute terrifying serenity amidst their chaotic storm of mockery. I let Patricia finish her screeching tirade. I let Connor continue his aggressive, nervous laughter. I let Vanessa revel in her stolen diamonds. I let them dig their social graves as deep as they possibly could. I watched the profound ignorance dancing in their eyes, knowing that this exact moment of arrogant triumph would haunt their memories for the rest of their bankrupt lives. I slowly reached behind my back and untied the coarse canvas apron they had forced me to wear. I pulled the heavy fabric over my head and let it fall carelessly onto the wooden floorboards, completely shedding the role of the subservient maid. I raised my right hand high into the air, making sure the gesture was clearly visible to every single person in the beachfront pavilion. I looked straight into Connor's terrified, shifting eyes. I positioned my thumb and my middle finger together. I did not speak a single word. I simply snapped my fingers. One loud, sharp, echoing crack that cut entirely through the laughter and the crashing waves. The sharp sound of my fingers snapping cut through the heavy tropical humidity with the precision of a gunshot. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Patricia still wore her ugly, victorious grin. Connor still stood with his arms crossed, waiting for me to break down and run away in tears. They expected the world to continue operating under their delusional rules. They were entirely unprepared for the reality I had orchestrated. From the shaded perimeters of the beachfront pavilion, the atmosphere instantly shifted. The ambient music playing through the hidden outdoor speakers abruptly cut off, leaving only the sound of the crashing ocean waves. Then came the synchronized, rhythmic sound of footsteps marching across the wooden boardwalk. It was not the casual stroll of resort guests. It was the heavy, deliberate, and highly disciplined stride of absolute authority. From the main entrance of the cabana, from behind the catering stations, and from the private security corridors, the true hierarchy of the Coral Keys Resort revealed itself. Mr. Caldwell, the seasoned general manager, led the procession. He wore a flawless, tailored navy suit, his posture impeccably straight. Behind him walked the executive head chef, dressed in a pristine white, double-breasted uniform. Flanking them were 6 members of the resort elite private security team, towering men wearing dark suits and discreet earpieces. They moved with a unified military precision that immediately drained the oxygen from the pavilion. Patricia turned her head, her cruel smile faltering as she watched the sheer number of high-level staff descending upon our location. She assumed they were coming to escort me off the premises. She took a step back, ready to gloat as security handled the hysterical daughter-in-law. She opened her mouth to issue a command to Mr. Caldwell, fully intending to play the role of the outraged, high-paying customer. She never got the chance to speak a single syllable. Mr. Caldwell completely ignored Patricia. He walked right past her outstretched hand, not even offering her a passing glance. The security team marched past Connor, their broad shoulders forcing him to take a sudden, unbalanced step backward. They did not stop until they reached the industrial grill. They moved in perfect unison, forming a solid, impenetrable human wall directly behind me. The head chef stood to my left. The security detail fanned out their hands, clasped behind their backs, their eyes scanning the wealthy crowd with cold, professional detachment. Mr. Caldwell stopped directly in front of me. The silence in the beachfront pavilion was absolute, thick, and suffocating. The wealthy real estate developers, the affluent retirees, and the local socialites were completely frozen, their champagne flutes hovering mid-air. They were witnessing a display of corporate allegiance that money simply could not buy. This was not customer service. This was absolute, unwavering loyalty to the true owner of the land they stood upon. Mr. Caldwell bowed his head in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a sleek silver tablet. It was the exact same device I had used in the underground bunker the night before, the master control terminal linked directly to the financial and operational mainframe of the entire property. He extended his hands, offering the silver tablet to me with the utmost reverence. His voice, usually reserved for the most elite dignitaries, carried across the pavilion with crystal-clear projection. "Welcome to the surface, Madam Chairman. All operational protocols have been secured. Every system awaits your direct command." I calmly reached out and took the silver tablet from his hands. The screen illuminated instantly, casting a cool blue light against my face. The impact of Mr. Caldwell's words hit the wealthy crowd like a physical shockwave. The local real estate developers, men who spent their entire lives reading power dynamics, instantly understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing. They looked at the young woman standing in front of the grill, the woman Patricia had just viciously degraded as a penniless maid, and realized they were standing in the presence of an apex predator. The whispering ceased entirely. The elite crowd collectively held their breath, completely captivated by the devastating reversal of fortune. I shifted my gaze from the glowing screen and looked at my so-called family. Patricia was paralyzed. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her heavily applied makeup looking like a grotesque mask. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but her vocal cords refused to function. Her brain simply could not process the paradigm shift. The uneducated working-class girl she had spent 5 years torturing was not a charity case. She was the sole proprietor of a multi-million-dollar luxury empire. The realization struck Patricia with such violent force that she physically swayed on her designer heels, clutching the edge of the bar counter just to keep herself from collapsing onto the marble floor. Rachel dropped her mimosa glass. It shattered against the wooden boardwalk, but she did not even flinch. She stared at the phalanx of security guards standing behind me, her eyes wide with mounting terror as the financial implications of my true identity began to dawn on her. Harrison stood frozen, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray, as he realized the woman he had plotted to defraud was holding the keys to his entire family's destruction. But my attention was completely anchored on Connor. The illusion of the brilliant, untouchable tech billionaire was actively disintegrating in real time. Connor took a trembling step backward. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked far too large for his shrinking, pathetic frame. His eyes darted wildly from the silver tablet in my hand to Mr. Caldwell, and then to the impenetrable wall of security personnel guarding my back. The oxygen seemed to vanish from his lungs. He tried to speak, tried to formulate a single cohesive sentence to regain control of the narrative, but only a raspy, broken wheeze escaped his throat. His legs began to violently tremble. The knees that had carried him through boardrooms and exclusive country clubs were giving way under the crushing weight of his exposed reality. He looked out at the wealthy local investors he had spent all morning lying to. He saw their expressions shifting from polite interest to outright disgust-filled realization. They were looking at a fraud. Connor brought a shaking hand to his chest, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. He realized in that exact agonizing second that he did not own this resort. He did not possess a massive tech fortune. He did not hold any power over the woman standing in front of him. The foundation of his arrogant, deceptive life had completely turned to ash, and he was left standing entirely exposed, terrified, and utterly powerless before the high society crowd he had desperately tried to conquer. I turned my attention away from my hyperventilating husband. My gaze swept past the terrified real estate developers and locked entirely onto the woman sitting in the premium cabana. Vanessa had frozen on her plush white cushion. The champagne flute in her hand was trembling so violently that the expensive liquid was spilling over the crystal rim and staining her pristine white silk sundress. The arrogant, triumphant smirk she had worn all morning had been completely erased. In its place was the raw, unadulterated panic of a woman realizing she had vastly underestimated her opponent. I walked slowly toward her cabana. The wall of private security personnel parted seamlessly to let me through closing ranks immediately behind me. The heavy silence of the pavilion amplified the sound of my footsteps on the wooden boardwalk. Every wealthy guest, every local socialite, and every member of my in-law family watched with bated breath. I stopped just a few feet away from Vanessa. I let my eyes drop to the base of her throat, staring directly at the massive $18,000 diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. I addressed her with the chilling detached professionalism of a corporate executive neutralizing a threat. I told her that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I explained that when she decided to sleep with a married man, she had committed a severe moral failing. But when she decided to access the secure internal accounting software of my resort to generate fake event invoices, she had committed a severe federal crime. I raised my voice just enough to ensure the surrounding investors could hear the exact nature of her corporate embezzlement. I detailed the $40,000 she had routed through dummy vendor accounts. I laid bare her entire scheme, describing the non-existent floral arrangements and phantom audiovisual equipment she had billed to a platinum credit line. I made sure everyone in that pavilion understood that she was not just a mistress. She was an active participant in a sophisticated wire fraud and money laundering conspiracy designed to steal money directly from a client account, which in this specific case belonged entirely to me. I looked her straight in the eyes and delivered the final corporate blow. I informed Vanessa that her employment at the Coral Keys Resort was terminated effective immediately. I stated that human resources had already cleared out her locker and deactivated her security credentials. But the sudden loss of her job was the absolute least of her problems. I told her that my private legal team had spent the entire morning compiling the digital paper trail of her embezzlement. I announced that a comprehensive dossier, including the high-definition security footage of her late-night confessions by the pool, had already been transmitted directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the State Economic Police. I watched the sheer, overwhelming terror flood her eyes as I informed her that corporate fraud of this magnitude carried a mandatory minimum prison sentence. The reality of her impending incarceration hit Vanessa with the force of a freight train. Her knees buckled completely. She collapsed onto the wooden floorboards of the cabana, the expensive white silk of her dress pooling around her like a surrendered flag. She began to hyperventilate, tears streaming down her face, destroying her immaculate makeup. Desperation clawed at her throat. She scrambled on her hands and knees, reaching her arms out toward the man who had promised her a luxurious life in Miami. She screamed for Connor. She begged him to tell the truth. She wailed that it was all his idea, that he had forced her to process the fake invoices that he had promised to protect her. She pleaded with him to use his massive tech fortune to hire lawyers and save her from prison. The entire high society crowd turned to look at the supposedly brilliant tech billionaire. Connor did not step forward to shield his mistress. He did not offer a single word of comfort or defense. Instead, he took another frantic, cowardly step backward. He held his hands up in a defensive, pathetic gesture, violently shaking his head. He looked at Vanessa with pure disgust and vehemently denied any involvement. He shouted that she was a crazy, obsessed employee who had acted entirely on her own. He threw the woman he had been kissing just hours ago directly under the proverbial bus, in a desperate, futile attempt to save his own skin. A collective murmur of absolute disgust rippled through the affluent guests. They were watching a man sacrifice his mistress to save himself, a display of spineless cowardice that completely shattered his manufactured aristocratic image. Vanessa let out a gut-wrenching sob, burying her face in her hands as she realized she had thrown her life away for a pathetic, penniless fraud. The absolute destruction of her golden child was finally too much for Patricia to bear. Her son was being publicly exposed as a criminal coward, and her own social standing was rapidly incinerating. She refused to accept total defeat. She desperately clawed for the one remaining lifeline she believed she possessed. Patricia pushed herself away from the bar counter. She marched forward, her face twisted in a mask of aggressive, desperate entitlement. She pointed her shaking finger at me, refusing to acknowledge the security team glaring down at her. She shrieked that none of my corporate threats mattered. She screamed that even if I had secretly purchased this resort, it was legally considered marital property. She loudly declared to the entire pavilion that under the law, Connor was entitled to exactly 50% of every single asset I owned. She proclaimed that her son owned half of this luxury resort and half of the Seattle estate, and that they would drag me through divorce court until they bled me completely dry. She stood there panting heavily, believing she had just played a triumphant legal trump card. She thought she still held the power to destroy my financial empire. The silence returned heavy with the threat of a massive legal war. But I did not need to answer her. From the deep shadows of the pavilion, a figure finally stepped forward into the harsh Florida sunlight. Terrence, the sharp, analytical corporate auditor, who had been treated like garbage by this family for years, smoothly buttoned his tailored linen suit jacket. He walked directly past Rachel, ignoring his wife's confused gasp, and took his place firmly by my side. Terrence positioned himself solidly beside me, a towering figure of absolute calm against the backdrop of Patricia's hysterical greed. The wealthy onlookers who had been murmuring amongst themselves fell completely silent once again. They recognized the unmistakable posture of a corporate auditor about to deliver a fatal financial autopsy. Terrence reached into the breast pocket of his impeccably tailored linen suit and withdrew a thick, neatly bound stack of heavily annotated documents. It was the comprehensive audit report he had shared with me in the dark corner of the lounge just hours ago. Patricia glared at him, her chest heaving with exertion. She demanded to know what the hired help was doing stepping into family business. She ordered Terrence to get out of the way and let Connor claim his rightful half of the billion-dollar empire. Terrence did not flinch at her racist and classist undertones. He looked down at the matriarch with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. He unfolded the audit report, adjusting his cuffs with slow, deliberate precision. He stated in a voice that commanded the entire beachfront pavilion that Patricia needed to sit down and remain entirely quiet because the financial fantasy she had constructed for her golden child was about to be legally eradicated. Terrence turned his dark, penetrating gaze directly onto Connor. He held up the first page of the report. He announced to the crowd that as a senior corporate auditor, he had taken the liberty of thoroughly reviewing the internal ledgers of Connor's highly publicized logistics startup. He spoke with the clinical, merciless cadence of a surgeon declaring a patient deceased. He informed Patricia that her brilliant visionary son did not possess a single ounce of equity in any legitimate enterprise. Terrence detailed how Connor had systematically burned through his venture capital, forging user metrics to mask a spectacular, catastrophic failure. He raised his voice, ensuring the regional real estate developers standing nearby heard every single word. Terrence declared that the only asset Connor currently possessed to his name was a toxic, insurmountable debt totaling exactly $4 million. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her throat. Connor visibly shrank, his eyes darting frantically, desperately looking for an escape route that did not exist. But Terrence was just getting started. He flipped to the second page of his massive dossier. He outlined the severe irregularities he had uncovered in Connor's payroll tax filings. He announced that Connor had not paid federal taxes in over 8 months, a deliberate act of corporate evasion that had already triggered an automatic flag within the Internal Revenue Service algorithms. Terrence stated coldly that Connor was not going to be fighting in divorce court for half a luxury resort. Connor was going to be fighting in federal court to avoid a lengthy sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. Patricia began to shake her head violently from side to side. She pointed a trembling finger at me, shrieking that it did not matter how much debt Connor had accumulated. She claimed that because we were legally married, my immense wealth would automatically absorb his liabilities, and he was still entitled to 50% of my private real estate holdings under community property statutes. Terrence let out a low, humorless laugh. He looked at Patricia with absolute disdain. He explained the fatal flaw in her uneducated legal theory. He detailed the specific ironclad severability clause buried deep within the prenuptial agreement Connor had signed 5 years ago without consulting a competent attorney. Terrence expertly broke down the legal phrasing, clarifying that any asset purchased exclusively with my private trust funds remained entirely shielded from marital property laws. He told Patricia that I did not owe Connor a single cent. I did not share his massive federal tax liabilities. I owned the Seattle estate free and clear, and I owned 85% of this luxury resort, while Connor owned absolutely nothing but his impending federal indictment. The crushing weight of the truth finally hit Patricia. Her legs gave out entirely. She collapsed onto a nearby teakwood chair, her face buried in her hands, her manicured fingers pulling at her perfectly styled hair. The reality of her son's utter financial ruin stripped away the last remaining shreds of her aristocratic delusion. Then Terrence turned his attention away from the shattered mother and the terrified son. He slowly pivoted on his heel and locked his eyes onto his own wife. Rachel had been standing near the shaded sofa, watching the destruction of her brother with wide, panicked eyes. When Terrence looked at her, she instinctively took a step backward. She tried to offer him a small, pleading smile, hoping that her husband would somehow shield her from the surrounding carnage. Terrence did not smile back. He flipped to the final section of his audit report. His voice lost all of its professional detachment, dropping into a tone of raw, deeply personal betrayal. He addressed Rachel directly. He told her that he had spent the last 3 months poring over their joint marital savings accounts, trying to understand why their financial reserves were constantly dwindling, despite his grueling 80-hour work weeks. He announced to the silent pavilion that he had discovered exactly where the money was going. Terrence publicly exposed his wife. He revealed that Rachel had been secretly siphoning tens of thousands of dollars from their life savings to artificially inflate the revenue of her failing garbage local boutique. He detailed how she had actively forged their monthly bank statements, deliberately lying to his face every single night to hide her massive financial bleeding. He told her that she had treated his hard-earned money with the same careless, disrespectful entitlement that her parents had always shown toward him. Rachel opened her mouth to deny the accusations, but no sound came out. The physical printed evidence was clutched firmly in her husband's hands, making any attempt at a lie completely futile. Terrence delivered the final devastating strike. He stated with absolute unwavering finality that he had met with his lawyers before boarding the plane to Florida. He informed Rachel that he had officially filed for divorce. He told her that he had frozen all of their remaining joint assets and reported her embezzlement to the bank. He looked his soon-to-be ex-wife up and down, utterly repulsed by the woman he had once loved. He told her that she was completely on her own and that she would be answering to the creditors for the monumental debt she had accrued behind his back. Rachel let out a piercing, agonizing scream. It was the high-pitched wail of a spoiled princess realizing she had just lost her endless supply of unearned wealth. She dropped to her knees on the wooden boardwalk, sobbing hysterically, her hands clutching frantically at the expensive fabric of her designer dress. Harrison, the patriarch who had enabled this toxic family for decades, could no longer maintain his silent complicity. He turned his back to the staring crowd, bringing his hands up to cover his pale, horrified face. He let out a ragged, defeated groan, fully comprehending the magnitude of their collective destruction. His son was a fraudulent debtor facing federal prison. His daughter was a divorced, bankrupt thief. His wife was a broken, publicly humiliated shell. The entire family had plunged headfirst into the abyss of absolute, inescapable ruin, left with absolutely nothing but the wreckage of their own arrogant choices. The pavilion resembled a graveyard of shattered egos. Rachel remained collapsed on the wooden floorboards, her manicured hands clutching the fabric of her designer dress as she wept over the total loss of her financial security. Harrison hid his face in his hands, completely broken by the public revelation of his children's severe economic crimes. Patricia sat paralyzed in the teakwood chair, her aristocratic illusion thoroughly dismantled by the man she had racially and socially profiled just hours prior. Terrence stood tall and unmoving, his breathing steady, having delivered the fatal, undeniable blow to his toxic marriage. I did not offer my in-laws a single glance of pity. They had forged their own heavy chains, and Terrence had merely handed them the key to their respective cells. I turned my attention back to the silver tablet Mr. Caldwell had placed in my hands. The emotional execution was complete, but the financial reckoning had just begun. I tapped a rapid sequence of encrypted commands on the glowing screen. A portable wireless thermal printer rested on the stainless steel prep table behind me, a device typically utilized by the head chef for inventory logs and premium supply orders. I synced the master control tablet directly to the small machine. The device hummed to life with a quiet mechanical precision. It began to spit out a stark white receipt. The paper flowed continuously, spooling down past the edge of the metal table and pooling into a messy pile onto the floorboards. It was a comically long, meticulously itemized ledger of their unearned, grotesque arrogance. Every single ounce of their indulgence over the past 3 days was officially documented. I watched the black ink print row after row of exorbitant charges. The vintage champagne Patricia had arrogantly demanded for breakfast. The imported caviar platters ordered to the private cabanas. The daily, all-inclusive luxury spa treatments for the women. The premium oceanfront pavilion rentals. The massive damages assessed for Vanessa intentionally ruining my silk blouse. The fraudulent event coordination charges Connor had attempted to process. The machine finally stopped printing. I gripped the top of the receipt and tore it from the dispenser with a sharp, decisive flick of my wrist. I gathered the long ribbon of paper, feeling the smooth, waxy texture beneath my fingertips. I walked over to where Connor stood trembling in his oversized suit. I did not hand the receipt to him. I let the heavy end of the paper unroll, dropping it so the bottom edge rested right at his expensive leather shoes. The white paper stretched between us like a physical, insurmountable boundary. He stared down at the black ink, his eyes wide with renewed, suffocating terror. I kept my voice perfectly even, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. I informed him that the complimentary ride was officially over. I detailed the exact nature of the document resting at his feet. I told him it was the comprehensive final invoice for his family's 3-day luxury vacation. I broke down the staggering totals for him while the wealthy real estate developers watched in absolute awe. I loudly listed the cost of the presidential oceanfront villa. I read off the prices of the top-tier room service and the premium reserve alcohol he had used to impress strangers. I factored in the exclusive concierge fees and a very specific, highly calculated penalty surcharge for property damage and emotional distress inflicted upon the resort ownership. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the final, inescapable number: $142,000. Connor choked on his own breath. He stammered wildly, taking a frantic step back. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice cracking as he claimed that I was supposed to pay for everything. He yelled that my platinum card was securely on file at the front desk, that he had secured the deposit, and that I was legally obligated to clear the balance. I offered him a cold, razor-sharp smile. I explained with absolute clarity that my platinum card was officially locked, canceled, and flagged for severe corporate fraud the exact minute he tried to buy his mistress a diamond tennis necklace. I reminded him of a very crucial, undeniable fact that he had conveniently forgotten in his quest for superiority. I pointed out that he was the one who marched up to the VIP reception desk on the first day. He was the one who arrogantly demanded the reservation be placed entirely under his own name to impress his mother and stroke his fragile ego. He was the one who signed the intake ledger with his own hand. By doing so, he assumed total, unmitigated legal liability for the entire stay. I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only he and his horrified parents could hear the fatal legal reality of their situation. I told him that in the state of Florida, consuming over $100,000 in luxury hospitality services without the actual financial means to settle the balance is not a civil dispute. It is a severe, undeniable felony. It is classified under the law as theft of services. It carries immediate mandatory jail time, and it is a crime that local law enforcement takes incredibly seriously when it involves high net worth properties. Connor looked around wildly like a trapped animal. He looked at his father, who refused to make eye contact and simply stared at the wooden floorboards. He looked at Patricia, who was hyperventilating in her chair, clutching her chest as her social standing evaporated. He looked at Vanessa, who was still weeping on the floor, completely useless and defeated. Connor had absolutely no one left to bail him out. He was a broke, fraudulent failure staring down a six-figure hotel bill he could never ever pay. He opened his mouth to beg. His knees buckled slightly. He was about to drop to the floor and plead for my mercy in front of the very people he had tried to impress. But he never got the chance to utter a single pathetic word. Cutting through the heavy, humid ocean air, a sharp, piercing wail disrupted the tense silence of the beachfront pavilion. It started as a distant echo, but rapidly grew louder, echoing violently down the main access road of the resort. It was the unmistakable, terrifying shriek of multiple police sirens approaching the main gates. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pristine glass panels of the resort lobby, casting an eerie, frantic glow over the beachfront pavilion. The wailing sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the heavy, authoritative slamming of car doors. 4 uniformed police officers, led by the county sheriff, marched down the wooden boardwalk. Their heavy boots thudded against the planks, a rhythmic march of impending justice that completely silenced the crashing of the ocean waves. The wealthy real estate developers and regional socialites parted instantly, clearing a wide path, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. I remained standing next to Mr. Caldwell, my posture perfectly composed and unyielding. I had placed the call to the Financial Crimes Division 2 hours ago from the underground office, providing them with the exact geolocation of the perpetrators. The sheriff approached my position, tipping the brim of his hat in a gesture of professional recognition. He asked to speak with the resort ownership regarding a reported felony embezzlement scheme and an ongoing theft of services. I stepped forward, formally identifying myself as the majority shareholder of the limited liability company that owned the property. I handed him the encrypted external drive Mr. Caldwell had meticulously prepared. I clearly stated that the drive contained irrefutable high-definition security footage, forged corporate invoices, and a direct digital paper trail proving wire fraud across state lines. I raised my hand and pointed directly at the premium cabana where the event coordinator was currently cowering on the floorboards. 2 officers immediately bypassed the stunned crowd and surrounded Vanessa. The mistress, who had paraded around in an $18,000 stolen diamond tennis necklace, was now hyperventilating, her white silk dress stained with spilled champagne and dirt from the wooden planks. The officers ordered her to stand up. When her trembling legs refused to support her weight, they hauled her to her feet by her arms. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists echoed brutally across the silent pavilion. Vanessa shrieked, a raw, desperate, agonizing sound. She thrashed against the officer's firm grip, violently twisting her head to locate the man who had promised her a luxurious, wealthy life in Miami. She screamed Connor's name over and over again, begging him to tell the police that it was all a massive misunderstanding. She pleaded with him to use his massive tech fortune to hire expensive lawyers and stop the arrest. Connor did not step forward to save her. He pressed his back against the open bar counter, his entire body trembling violently. He treated the woman he had just been passionately kissing hours ago as if she were a highly contagious disease. He refused to make eye contact with her, actively abandoning her to the authorities without uttering a single word of defense. The undeniable reality of the police presence completely shattered Patricia's remaining sanity. The aristocratic matriarch, who had just viciously ordered me to eat a pathetic salad next to the garbage bins, suddenly transformed into a terrified, desperate beggar. She scrambled out of her teakwood chair, stumbling awkwardly over her own expensive designer heels. She lunged toward me, her hands reaching out wildly to grab the fabric of my clothes. I took a swift, deliberate step backward, allowing my private security detail to intercept her advance. A towering guard firmly blocked her path, forcing her to stay back. Patricia fell heavily to her knees right there on the wooden boardwalk in front of all her high society friends. Tears destroyed her heavy, meticulous makeup, leaving dark, ugly streaks running down her pale face. She wailed loudly, begging me for forgiveness, pleading with me to remember that we were family and that family protects each other. She sobbed that she had been entirely wrong, that she had severely misjudged me, and that she would do absolutely anything I wanted if I just called off the authorities. Harrison pushed past his weeping wife, his face a canvas of total humiliating defeat. The patriarch, who had ruthlessly plotted to steal equity from my Seattle home just the night before, now held his hands up in a gesture of pathetic, absolute surrender. His voice cracked as he begged me to clear the $142,000 invoice. He pleaded that Connor was a good boy who simply made a terrible business mistake under the immense pressure of his startup. Harrison swore that if I just paid the bill and stopped the police from investigating the felony theft of services, he would personally ensure that Connor paid me back every single cent. It was a completely empty, laughable promise from a man whose own son was drowning in $4 million of toxic debt and facing imminent federal tax evasion charges. I looked down at the two pathetic figures groveling at the feet of my security team. I felt absolutely nothing for them. I possessed no sympathy, no lingering familial attachment, and no desire to offer a single ounce of grace to these monsters. They had spent years attempting to systematically destroy my dignity, and now they were demanding my mercy simply to save themselves from the severe legal consequences of their own horrific actions. I turned my attention away from my weeping in-laws and looked directly at the sheriff. I kept my voice incredibly calm, delivering my instructions with the clinical, merciless detachment of a corporate executive neutralizing a trespassing threat. I informed the sheriff that these specific individuals had fraudulently consumed a massive amount of luxury hospitality services under false pretenses. I stated clearly that my financial team had confirmed they possessed absolutely no financial means to settle their exorbitant balance. I declared that their hysterical presence was severely disrupting the peace of my affluent guests and violating the resort's strict code of conduct. I looked the sheriff right in the eyes and formally requested that he escort these trespassers off my private property immediately. The sheriff nodded, adjusting his utility belt, and signaled his deputies to move in and clear the pavilion. As the uniformed officers approached the family to enforce the eviction, the ultimate devastating collapse finally occurred. Connor, the golden child, the arrogant tech chief executive officer who had proudly flaunted his fake wealth and insulted me all morning, completely broke down. He dropped heavily onto his knees on the hard wooden floorboards, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling around his shaking frame. He buried his face in his hands, weeping with loud, pathetic, gasping sobs that echoed over the sound of the ocean. It was the absolute, undeniable antithesis of the smug, condescending man who had laughed at my pain at the beginning of the day. He was a terrified, bankrupt fraud facing the total destruction of his entire life, completely stripped of his power, his mistress, and his false legacy. I stood there for a fraction of a second, watching his pathetic display of tears. I did not blink. I did not offer him a single word of comfort or closure. I simply turned my back on him and walked away. The heavy footsteps of the county deputies echoed across the wooden boardwalk as they forcefully escorted my former family out of the beachfront pavilion. I did not look back. The transition from elite, untouchable resort guests to common, humiliated trespassers occurred with brutal and breathtaking efficiency. The officers did not offer Patricia a polite arm to lean on, nor did they show Harrison the deferential respect he had demanded his entire life. They simply corralled the weeping, broken individuals and marched them away. I stood silently next to the general manager watching the pathetic procession disappear into the grand lobby. The wealthy onlookers, who had previously cowered under Patricia's manufactured aristocratic gaze, now openly pointed and whispered, thoroughly entertained by the spectacular public destruction of a fraudulent tech dynasty. A few minutes later, the resort security team executed my final operational directive. The bellhops who had been subjected to the family's relentless verbal abuse and demeaning demands for 3 straight days systematically cleared out the presidential oceanfront villa. They did not handle the imported leather luggage with white gloves. They piled the heavy, oversized suitcases onto industrial utility carts and rolled them straight out the service exit. Connor's expensive Italian suits, Rachel's frivolous boutique purchases, and Patricia's suffocating mink coat were unceremoniously dumped in a chaotic, disorganized heap directly beside the main security gates, completely exposed to the unforgiving elements. The Florida sun had reached its absolute zenith, baking the black asphalt of the coastal highway outside the resort walls. The temperature hovered near 100 degrees, creating shimmering heat waves that distorted the air. The deputies escorted the family past the towering stone pillars marking the boundary of my property. They were not allowed to wait in the air-conditioned valet lounge. They were not offered a courtesy shuttle to a local airport. They were physically directed onto the blazing, dusty shoulder of the public highway and told not to step foot on the private driveway ever again. It was a scene of unparalleled poetic justice. Patricia stood on the side of the busy road in her wrinkled, champagne-stained designer dress, her meticulously styled hair now plastered to her forehead with sweat. She frantically waved her arms at passing luxury vehicles, desperately hoping a wealthy acquaintance might recognize her and offer salvation. No one stopped. Harrison sat heavily on one of the overturned suitcases, his head buried in his hands, completely paralyzed by the realization that his retirement accounts were empty and his social standing was permanently eradicated. Rachel paced erratically back and forth along the hot asphalt, screaming at her phone as she realized her credit cards were entirely frozen and her boutique creditors were likely already seizing her storefront assets. Her shrill voice was completely drowned out by the roar of passing commercial trucks. And then there was Connor. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer was reduced to a miserable, weeping mess. He knelt on the dusty ground beside his ruined luggage, entirely stripped of his power, his stolen wealth, and his mistress. He possessed no transportation, no available funds, and no future outside of a federal courtroom. He stared through the wrought iron gates of the resort, finally understanding the true devastating cost of his towering arrogance. I did not watch their ultimate degradation from the ground level. I had taken the private secure elevator directly up to the highest vantage point the property offered. I stepped out onto the expansive wraparound terrace of the Supreme VIP penthouse. The ocean breeze was cool and refreshing at this altitude, entirely detached from the suffocating heat and misery unfolding on the highway below. The panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a brilliant, sparkling turquoise canvas of absolute tranquility. The sliding glass door hummed softly as it opened behind me. Terrence stepped out onto the sunlit terrace. He had shed his professional, rigid demeanor completely. His tailored linen suit jacket was unbuttoned, his posture relaxed, exuding the undeniable aura of a man who had just successfully amputated a massive toxic weight from his life. The sharp, analytical corporate auditor had meticulously dismantled his own prison, and he had emerged completely victorious. He walked over to the edge of the glass railing and stood right beside me, looking down at the pathetic display of ruin happening far below our feet. A discreet, white-gloved attendant stepped onto the balcony carrying a silver tray adorned with 2 crystal flutes, filled with the absolute finest vintage champagne the resort cellars possessed. We both reached out and took a glass, the cold crystal feeling perfectly grounding against my skin. The attendant bowed slightly and vanished back into the penthouse, leaving us entirely alone in the quiet, elevated sanctuary. Terence looked down at the highway one last time. He watched his soon-to-be ex-wife kick a suitcase in a fit of impotent rage. He watched the family that had subjected him to endless suffocating racial and classist microaggressions finally facing the brutal consequences of their own malicious entitlement. He turned his dark, penetrating eyes toward me. A slow, genuine smile broke across his face, completely altering his usually stoic features. He raised his crystal flute into the air, holding it steady against the backdrop of the vibrant blue sky. He spoke with a deep, resonant voice filled with absolute clarity and profound relief. "Congratulations on your freedom, Hannah. It was a flawlessly executed plan." I turned away from the glass railing, completely dismissing the miserable figures baking on the asphalt below. They no longer occupied a single fraction of my mind. I looked at Terence, acknowledging the brilliant silent partnership that had orchestrated the perfect, devastating downfall of a family of predators. I raised my own crystal flute and tapped it gently against his. The crisp, clear chime of the expensive glass rang out a victorious, melodic sound that signaled the absolute end of the war. I allowed a small, cold, highly satisfied smile to curve the edges of my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the chilled champagne, savoring the crisp, expensive taste of total victory. I looked him straight in the eyes and delivered my final verdict. "Congratulations on clearing out the garbage," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any lingering emotion. "This world has absolutely no room for parasites who demand to sit on a throne." The most profound lesson we can take away from this story is the dangerous illusion of arrogance and the undeniable power of silent competence. Society often teaches us that power is loud, flashy, and demanding. People like the in-laws in this story believe that wealth is a weapon used to belittle others, masking their own deep insecurities and financial ruins behind designer clothes and cruel words. They mistook kindness for weakness and silence for submission. However, true power never needs to scream for attention. It operates in the shadows, builds solid foundations, and strikes only when the time is absolutely perfect. When you know your own worth, you do not need external validation from toxic individuals who are determined to misunderstand you. You do not have to argue with those who are committed to treating you poorly based on your background. Instead, you focus on your growth. Secure your own independence and let their own massive egos become the very tools of their ultimate destruction. Furthermore, this narrative is a brilliant masterclass in establishing ironclad boundaries. Marriage and social status do not give anyone the absolute right to abuse you or exploit your hard-earned resources. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to completely sever ties with those who drain your spirit and disrespect your existence. You do not have to save people who are actively trying to drown you. Let their natural consequences catch up to them while you elevate your own life. You are the sole architect of your future, and you have the absolute right to remove anyone who refuses to treat you with basic human dignity. If you have ever had to quietly build your strength while dealing with toxic people who severely underestimated you, let us know how you claimed your ultimate victory in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories.